On December 25th, 2010, in the early hours of Christmas morning, an unsuspecting couple set out for a walk with their dogs through a remote, snow-covered woodland. Suddenly, one of the dogs became agitated. It stopped abruptly, its nose pressed firmly against the snow, sniffing intently at something hidden beneath the white surface. The owners, at first assuming their pet had discovered a buried animal or some discarded object, stepped closer out of curiosity. However, their intrigue quickly turned to horror. As the snow was pushed aside, something unnatural began to emerge, a pale, lifeless limb protruding from the icy ground. Law enforcement officers arrived promptly at the scene. The body, frozen and partially concealed beneath the heavy snowfall, was soon identified as that of Joanna Yates. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. In this documentary, we will investigate a real crime that happened to Joanna Claire Yates, was born on April 19, 1985, in the picturesque county of Hampshire, England. She was the youngest of two children in the loving and well-respected family of David and Teresa Yates. Her upbringing was filled with warmth, support, and privilege, as both of her parents held high-ranking managerial positions in successful corporations. From an early age, Joanna exhibited remarkable intelligence, creativity, and determination. She was a naturally gifted child with an innate ability to excel academically and artistically. Her parents noticed her exceptional abilities early on and encouraged her to develop them to their fullest potential. Joanna was passionate about nature, aesthetics, and design, which naturally led her to pursue a career in landscape architecture. When the time came to choose a university, she enrolled at the highly regarded University of Essex, where she pursued her studies in landscape design with unwavering enthusiasm and dedication. Joanna had always dreamed of working in a field that allowed her to blend art with functionality, and her natural eye for beauty made her an exceptional designer. She was diligent, meticulous, and always sought perfection in her work. Shortly after obtaining her degree, her talents were recognized by a prestigious design firm that offered her a promising position. Eager to prove herself, Joanna seized the opportunity and quickly rose through the ranks. Her exceptional skills and strong work ethic set her apart from her colleagues, and within a few years, she had earned the title of department head, a remarkable feat for someone so young. In 2008, while working at the firm, Joanna met Greg Reardon, a talented and ambitious engineer who was just 2 years her senior. Greg was intelligent, driven, and shared many of Joanna's aspirations. Their connection was instantaneous, and their relationship blossomed rapidly. They complemented each other perfectly, balancing their careers with their growing love for one another. Within a year of dating, they made the decision to move in together, renting a cozy apartment where they could build their future. Though they deeply loved each other, they chose not to rush into marriage. Instead, they focused on their professional growth and financial stability, setting aside savings for their future wedding and the home they dreamed of owning. Everything seemed to be falling into place for the couple. Their relationship was strong, their careers were flourishing, and they had a bright future ahead. So, when Joanna received an enticing job offer in the autumn of 2010 from a top-tier construction and design firm in Bristol, she saw it as an incredible opportunity. Without hesitation, she accepted the position, and together with Greg, they began preparing for their big move. Greg, who worked for a large engineering company, was able to transfer to a different branch in Bristol, allowing them to continue their lives together seamlessly. By mid-October 2010, Joanna and Greg settled into their new home, a charming ground-floor apartment in a 2-story house situated in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Bristol. The property belonged to Christopher Jeff, the landlord who lived on the upper floor, while another young couple had recently moved into the second ground-floor unit. The neighborhood had an air of safety and tranquility, making it the ideal place for the couple to begin this new chapter in their lives. By mid-December, they were eagerly preparing to celebrate their first Christmas in Bristol. They decorated their home with festive lights, put up a beautifully adorned Christmas tree, and meticulously wrapped gifts for their loved ones. Every evening, they would sit together, writing heartfelt holiday cards to their families and friends, dreaming about the wonderful life they were building together. On Friday, December 17, 2010, Greg packed his bags and left for Sheffield to spend the weekend with his parents. Joanna, who had commitments in Bristol, decided to stay behind. She had made plans to meet her friends and colleagues for a night out, celebrating the approaching holidays before dedicating the rest of the weekend to finishing Christmas preparations. She had also promised Greg that she would prepare a romantic dinner for his return, looking forward to their quiet evening together before the holiday rush. The evening unfolded exactly as she had envisioned. Joanna met her friends at a lively bar where they enjoyed drinks, danced, and shared stories about their holiday plans. Laughter filled the air as they celebrated the festive season, making memories that Joanna had looked forward to for weeks. At around 8 p.m., she bid farewell to her friends, mentioning that she planned to stop at a store to pick up some food before heading home. She called Greg to let him know that she was on her way back and promised to text him before going to bed. That was the last time anyone heard from her. Over the weekend, Greg tried reaching out to Joanna multiple times, but his calls and messages went unanswered. Initially, he brushed it off, assuming she was busy with holiday preparations or experiencing occasional network issues in their area. However, as the hours passed with no response, his concern grew. When Greg finally arrived home late that evening, he was immediately struck by an overwhelming sense of unease. The first thing he noticed was that their front door was unlocked, a detail that sent a shiver down his spine. Second, Joanna herself was nowhere to be found, even though her purse, keys, and wallet were in their usual places. Her cell phone, which Greg called in a desperate attempt to reach her, suddenly rang from the couch in their living room. It was lying there, untouched, as though she had left it behind without a second thought. Their pet cat, normally well-fed and active, appeared extremely hungry, meowing loudly, suggesting that it hadn't been fed in days. Her car remained parked in the garage, and her winter coat and boots, the ones she would never leave without, were still hanging by the entrance. The situation was completely baffling. How could Joanna have disappeared without taking her essential belongings, especially in the dead of winter when temperatures had plummeted and heavy snowfall blanketed the city? Realizing something was terribly wrong, Greg immediately contacted the police. Given the circumstances, an unlocked door, untouched valuables, and no communication for over 48 hours, law enforcement took the case seriously and launched a full-scale investigation. Detectives began by reconstructing Joanna's last known movements, piecing together a timeline from witness accounts and surveillance footage. The bar, situated about a 20-minute drive from her apartment, was a familiar and safe place. Security cameras showed Joanna leaving around 8:30 p.m., heading toward her car, alone. On her way home, she stopped by a nearby supermarket, purchasing a pre-made pizza and 2 bottles of beer, her usual choice for a relaxing evening. The receipt found in her apartment confirmed the transaction time. Joanna arrived home around 9 p.m. and briefly exchanged messages with a few friends regarding an upcoming Christmas party. She preheated the oven, placed the pizza inside, set out a plate, and placed the beer on the table. One of the bottles had been opened, though barely touched, with just a couple of sips missing. The kitchen scene suggested that she had been preparing to sit down for a quiet meal when something interrupted her. What could have happened in that moment? Detectives carefully combed through the apartment for any signs of forced entry, yet nothing indicated a break-in. No windows were shattered, no locks were tampered with, and there were no immediate signs of struggle. More notably, there was no blood, no overturned furniture, and no indication that someone had ransacked the place. It was as if Joanna had simply vanished into thin air. The police ruled out robbery as a motive. Her cash, bank cards, and valuable possessions remained untouched. This pointed to a far more chilling possibility. She may have been taken by someone she trusted enough to willingly let inside. The lack of any obvious struggle puzzled investigators, but another strange detail emerged. While the beer remained on the table, the pizza was missing entirely. There was no trace of it in the apartment, no empty box in the trash, no half-eaten leftovers in the fridge. Yet the plate, utensils, and neatly placed napkins suggested she had been just about to eat. Where had the pizza gone? Had she actually started eating only to be interrupted? The search for Joanna escalated on Monday, December 20th. Teams of officers scoured the surrounding areas, knocking on doors, questioning neighbors, and reviewing hours of surveillance footage. Despite their best efforts, no significant leads emerged. There were no ransom demands, no suspicious activity detected near her home, and no clear explanation for her sudden disappearance. As time passed without any sign of Joanna, investigators feared the worst. On Tuesday, her distraught parents, brother, and boyfriend made a public appeal on television, pleading for any information that could lead to her whereabouts. A reward of £10,000 was initially offered for credible tips, and within days, it was raised to £50,000 in a desperate bid to incentivize the public's cooperation. Despite these efforts, no credible leads materialized, and the investigation stalled. The case had officially turned into a terrifying mystery. Determined to find answers, police meticulously retraced Joanna's drive home from the bar. They reviewed street cameras along her route, confirming that no other vehicle had followed her and that she had driven straight home without making any unexplained stops. There was no evidence to suggest she had been abducted on the way. With no immediate suspects and no clear motive, detectives turned their focus to Joanna's inner circle, scrutinizing her relationships and daily interactions. Did she have conflicts with anyone? Was there a hidden dispute, a jealous acquaintance, or an unknown enemy? However, their search revealed nothing alarming. Joanna was well-liked and respected both at work and in her social circles. There was no history of threats, no troubled relationships, and no known enemies. She had never expressed fear or concerns about anyone. As is standard in cases of unexplained disappearances, the police had to consider the possibility that her boyfriend, Greg Reardon, might be involved. Despite his apparent distress, he became the primary person of interest. Investigators probed every detail of Greg's life, searching for inconsistencies or potential motives. After all, a trip to another city could have served as a convenient cover, providing an alibi while masking sinister intentions. However, investigators were soon able to confirm that Greg Reardon had worked a full day on Friday before leaving Bristol and driving straight to his parents' home in Sheffield. Along the way, he stopped at a gas station on the highway, where a receipt timestamped at 9 p.m. indicated that he was already nearing his destination at that time. By 9:30 p.m., he had arrived at his family's house, as corroborated by his parents and siblings, all of whom stated that he did not leave the house at any point during the weekend. Further evidence bolstered Greg's alibi. Phone records showed that he had made numerous attempts to contact Joanna over the course of the weekend, placing dozens of calls and sending multiple text and voice messages, none of which received a reply. Additionally, traffic and surveillance footage confirmed his journey and whereabouts. After thoroughly verifying all evidence, investigators determined that Greg could not have returned to Bristol without detection. As a result, he was formally cleared of suspicion and removed from the list of potential suspects. On December 25, 2010, 8 days after Joanna's disappearance, the case took a grim and shocking turn. Early that Christmas morning, a couple was walking their dogs through a remote, snow-covered woodland about 3 miles from Joanna's apartment when one of the dogs began sniffing and frantically digging at something beneath the snow. The owners, curious and alarmed, approached the area only to recoil in horror upon realizing that their pet had uncovered what appeared to be a human leg protruding from the snowdrift. Trembling with fear, they immediately contacted the police. Responding officers arrived swiftly, securing the area and beginning the painstaking task of uncovering the snow-covered remains. As they carefully removed layers of ice and debris, they uncovered the body of a young woman, partially buried beneath a mixture of branches, leaves, and thick snow. The freezing temperatures had preserved the remains remarkably well, preventing decomposition despite the body being left exposed for days. Authorities quickly identified the victim as Joanna Yates, a devastating confirmation for her grieving family and friends. A forensic examination revealed harrowing details of the brutal crime. Joanna had sustained over 40 separate injuries, including extensive bruising, multiple lacerations, and defensive wounds on her arms and hands, clear indicators that she had fought desperately to defend herself. In addition, her ribs had been broken, her nose fractured, and deep pressure marks were found around her neck. The cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation, suggesting that she had been overpowered and suffocated by her attacker. Strangely, an autopsy revealed that despite buying a pizza before returning home, no food was found in Joanna's stomach, suggesting she had never had the chance to eat before the attack. This chilling revelation led investigators to conclude that the crime had not occurred in her apartment but elsewhere. and that her body had later been transported to the remote wooded area in an attempt to cover up evidence. The killer had made a crude effort to conceal the remains by covering them with branches and foliage. However, an intense snowstorm in the following days buried the body under a thick layer of snow, inadvertently delaying its discovery for over a week. Despite the area being frequented by joggers and dog walkers, it had remained hidden from view. Joanna was found wearing the same outfit she had been seen in at the bar on the night of her disappearance. Her coat, however, was missing. Investigators noted another unusual detail. Joanna, who often wore knitted socks instead of slippers at home, had only one sock remaining on her foot. The other sock was missing and was not found either at the crime scene or in her apartment. This raised a disturbing possibility. The killer might have taken it as a trophy, a behavior commonly observed among repeat offenders with violent patterns. With the discovery of Joanna's remains, the nature of the investigation shifted dramatically. What had begun as a missing person case was now officially classified as a homicide. A full-scale operation was launched, involving some of the nation's most experienced forensic experts, many of whom were brought in from London. Despite their best efforts, detectives initially struggled to generate significant leads. Interviews with neighbors in Joanna's building yielded little valuable information, as no one reported seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary on the night of her disappearance. There were no apparent signs of forced entry in her apartment, and surveillance footage showed no suspicious individuals lingering outside her home. Investigators turned their attention to Joanna's immediate surroundings, examining those who lived in close proximity to her. On the ground floor of the same building where she lived, another unit was rented by 32-year-old engineer Vincent Tabak and his fiancée, 28-year-old Tanya. The couple had moved into the apartment a few months earlier and, on the surface, appeared to be a quiet, unassuming pair. Vincent Tabak claimed that he barely knew Joanna, stating that they had only exchanged pleasantries a handful of times since she and Greg had moved into the building. On that fateful Friday evening, Vincent Tabak also claimed that he had been at home resting and did not leave the house until Tanya called him, requesting a ride home from the Christmas party. He maintained that he had spent most of the evening alone, watching television and browsing the internet, only stepping out briefly to purchase some items from a nearby store before later driving to pick up his fiancée. Across the street from Joanna's apartment, a lively house party was in full swing that evening, with loud music reverberating through the neighborhood and a crowd of guests drinking heavily. Some of the partygoers admitted to being too intoxicated to recall any specific details about the surrounding area that night. However, at approximately 9:30 p.m., a few individuals who had stepped onto the balcony to smoke reported hearing a woman scream. The sound was brief, quickly fading into the night, and they dismissed it as an unremarkable incident, attributing it to the usual background noise of a busy residential area. As the investigation progressed, detectives soon turned their attention to 63-year-old Christopher Jeff, the landlord who owned the building where Joanna and Greg resided. Jeff, a retired schoolteacher, had lived alone for several years. Neighbors described him as eccentric but harmless. A well-read, intelligent man with peculiar mannerisms and an old-fashioned sense of dress. His long white hair and sometimes reclusive lifestyle had made him an enigmatic figure in the community. Some found him odd, but few could imagine him being involved in a violent crime. When police brought Jeff in for a questioning, he appeared noticeably anxious, though he willingly cooperated with investigators. He reiterated that on the night of Joanna's disappearance, he had gone to the gym as part of his routine, a habit he maintained 3 times a week. According to his account, he returned home around 9 p.m., locked his door, and went to bed shortly after. He insisted that he had heard and seen nothing unusual that night, nor had he left his apartment until the following morning. However, his alibi was uncorroborated. No one could confirm whether he had truly remained in his apartment as he claimed. As detectives pressed him for more details, Jeff hesitated before suddenly recalling a detail he had previously omitted. He claimed that as he returned from the gym that night, he noticed 3 unfamiliar young men lingering near the property. He stated that he had never seen them before and did not pay much attention to them at the time. However, when asked for a description of these men, Jeff was vague, explaining that it had been too dark to see them clearly. Investigators found this sudden addition to his account suspicious, as it seemed to emerge only under pressure. Meanwhile, Vincent Tabak, who occupied the other ground floor apartment with Tanya, told detectives that he had left the house twice that night. Once around 9 p.m. to visit a store, and later at 2 a.m. to pick Tanya up from her party. In his statement, he recalled that when he first left at 9 p.m., Jeff's car was parked in its usual position in the driveway. However, upon returning at 2 a.m., he noticed that the car was still in the driveway but was now facing the opposite direction, as though it had been moved during the night. This directly contradicted Jeff's claim that he had not left his home, raising further suspicion. Greg, the victim's boyfriend, also provided investigators with a potentially significant detail. On the morning of December 17th, just before he departed for the weekend, he had a brief conversation with Jeff. During their exchange, Greg had mentioned that he would be away for a few days and that Joanna would be home alone. If Jeff had been aware of this, it raised questions about whether Joanna's vulnerability had played a role in the tragic events that followed. As the case gained widespread media attention, information about law enforcement's focus on Christopher Jeff was leaked to the press. The revelation that a retired schoolteacher had become a person of interest in the high-profile murder case caused a sensationalist frenzy. Within hours, tabloids began publishing lurid, unfounded speculations about Jeff's past, suggesting, without evidence, that he had a history of inappropriate behavior during his teaching career. Though these allegations were entirely baseless, they took on a life of their own. Public perception began shifting against Jeff, despite the lack of concrete evidence linking him to the crime. In a matter of days, the media coverage spiraled into hysteria. News outlets bombarded Jeff's neighborhood, camping outside his home and hounding him with intrusive questions. Neighbors, who had once viewed him as a harmless eccentric, now eyed him with suspicion. Some members of the public, inflamed by misleading reports, began making aggressive demands for his arrest. By late December, Jeff's life had unraveled. He could no longer step outside without being confronted by hostile reporters and enraged locals, some of whom seemed eager to take justice into their own hands. The overwhelming pressure mounted on law enforcement, and on December 30th, the police arrested Christopher Jeff and conducted a thorough search of his home. The retired teacher continued to assert his innocence, insisting he had no involvement in the crime. During the meticulous search of Christopher Jeff's home, police discovered a pair of shoes with unusual brown stains. Given the nature of the investigation, the shoes were immediately sent to a forensic lab for analysis. Investigators also took a DNA sample from Jeff to compare with the biological material recovered from Joanna's body and clothing. As speculation mounted, the results from the lab finally arrived. To Jeff's relief, the stains on the shoes turned out to be nothing more than ordinary dirt, and his DNA did not match any of the forensic evidence connected to the crime. With no tangible link between Jeff and the murder, law enforcement had no choice but to release him from custody. Despite his official exoneration, the damage had already been done. The relentless media scrutiny did not abate, and the public, already swayed by weeks of sensationalized reporting, found it difficult to separate facts from conjecture. The headlines, once eager to paint him as a sinister figure, now treated his release with skepticism, and the stigma of suspicion continued to shadow his daily life. Jeff, once a quiet and respected educator, had become a pariah in his own community. With Jeff ruled out as a suspect, the investigation took a sharp turn toward another person of interest, Vincent Tabak, Joanna's neighbor. Until this point, Tabak had only been considered a witness, but inconsistencies in his statements began to raise concerns. Detectives noticed that he had gone out of his way to subtly shift suspicion toward Jeff during questioning. More concerning was the faint, healing scratches on his neck, which he failed to provide a clear explanation for. When asked about his relationship with Joanna, he downplayed their interactions, insisting that he hardly knew her. However, investigators found his responses evasive and suspicious. At this stage, police requested a DNA sample from Tabak. Almost immediately, he became visibly anxious, attempting to refuse the request. He offered an unusual explanation, claiming that he had entered Joanna's apartment while it was unoccupied and may have inadvertently left traces of himself there. His resistance only deepened detectives' suspicions. The DNA test proceeded, and when the results came back, forensic analysts found a partial match to the degraded biological material recovered from Joanna's body. While the result was incomplete due to prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures and possible contamination, it was a pivotal moment in the case. This revelation fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Vincent Tabak was no longer just a witness. He became the primary suspect. Although the DNA match was not absolute, it provided enough evidence to justify his immediate arrest. On January 11, 2011, police took Tabak into custody and launched an exhaustive search of his apartment, vehicle, and electronic devices. The findings would soon paint a dark and disturbing picture of the man they were dealing with. Although Tabak had no prior criminal record and had maintained an unassuming lifestyle, investigators uncovered evidence that suggested a deeply troubling side to his personality. His personal and professional acquaintances described him as quiet, polite, and highly intelligent. He was engaged to be married, had a promising career as an engineer, and did not exhibit any outwardly aggressive tendencies. However, as police delved into his private life, they discovered shocking evidence that would shatter the image of the mild-mannered professional. Inside Tabak's car, forensic experts detected a strong odor of cleaning agents, signaling an attempt to meticulously scrub the interior. However, despite his efforts, he had failed to erase all traces of incriminating evidence. Underneath the trunk lining, investigators found small drops of blood, which DNA testing confirmed belonged to Joanna. Additionally, fibers from Joanna's clothing were found embedded in the car's fabric. These discoveries indicated that her body had been transported in his vehicle, contradicting his previous claims of having no involvement in her disappearance. More disturbing revelations emerged when detectives examined Tabak's laptop. A deep forensic search exposed a collection of highly graphic, violent material that depicted extreme mistreatment of women. His browsing history showed an escalating pattern of searches related to violent fantasies and criminal behavior. He had actively sought out content that revolved around non-consensual encounters, and investigators believed that his obsession had taken a sinister turn when he encountered Joanna that night. In addition, records revealed that Tabak had been closely following every detail of the Yates case. He obsessively read news articles, monitored the police's progress, and even engaged in online discussions regarding possible suspects, going so far as to subtly direct attention toward Jeff. 2 days after his arrest, on January 13, Tabak was formally charged with first-degree homicide. The overwhelming accumulation of evidence had cornered him, and realizing that denial was futile, he changed his approach. Instead of outright denial, he offered his own version of events, attempting to minimize his culpability. According to Tabak, he had been returning home from the store when he noticed Joanna through her window. He claimed that she had smiled and waved at him, inviting him inside. Once in her apartment, he alleged that she made an intimate advance, which he responded to enthusiastically. However, he stated that when she abruptly changed her mind and began screaming, he panicked. Vincent Tabak initially alleged that he had instinctively covered Joanna Yates's mouth in a desperate attempt to silence her, fearing that her screams would attract the attention of nearby neighbors. He claimed that he held his hand over her mouth for no more than 30 seconds, and when he finally let go, he realized she was no longer breathing. He explained that his only objective thereafter was to conceal what had happened, which led him to dispose of her body in an act of fear rather than premeditation. However, Tabak's narrative was riddled with inconsistencies and failed to explain the severity of the injuries found on Joanna's body. In addition to being strangled, Joanna had suffered broken ribs, bruises, and other injuries that suggested she had been overpowered with considerable force. Furthermore, the blood evidence found in the trunk of Tabak's car contradicted his claim of panic-fueled disposal. If the killing had been accidental, why was there evidence of blood in a location that indicated transportation? Investigators quickly dismissed Tabak's version of events and, instead, proposed a far more sinister scenario. They theorized that Vincent Tabak had developed an unhealthy and secretive fixation on Joanna. They speculated that he had been watching her closely for some time, waiting for the right opportunity to act on his dark impulses. He was fully aware that she would be alone for the weekend, having overheard part of a conversation between Greg and Christopher Jeff that morning. On the night of the crime, Tabak allegedly observed Joanna returning home and, seizing the opportunity, approached her door under false pretenses. He convinced her to let him inside, likely by feigning friendliness or requesting help with something trivial. Once inside, however, his demeanor shifted. Investigators believe that he initiated unwanted advances, which were immediately rebuffed. When Joanna resisted, Tabak became violent, pinning her down with his full weight and crushing her ribcage. The brutality of the attack rendered Joanna incapable of defending herself or calling for help. Vincent Tabak's trial commenced in October 2011, capturing nationwide attention. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Tabak opted to represent himself in court, declining any legal representation. He maintained his claim that Joanna's death had been accidental, hoping to convince the jury to grant him leniency in sentencing. However, prosecutors presented a compelling case against him, laying out the forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and his own suspicious behaviors leading up to and after the crime. The jury was unconvinced by his attempts to downplay the severity of his actions. On October 28, 2011, Vincent Tabak was found guilty of first-degree homicide. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving a minimum of 20 years. However, as further investigations into his personal life continued, an additional year was later added to his sentence due to his possession of unlawful images and videos, which further cemented his profile as a deeply disturbed individual. Sirens shattered the silence of the night as police officers arrived at Crystal Perry's home. The moment they stepped inside, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood covered nearly every surface. The floor, the countertops, the walls, turning the entire kitchen into a canvas of crimson. Even the most experienced medical professionals could see at a glance that she had stood no chance. No matter how quickly paramedics might have arrived, the sheer extent of blood loss had made survival impossible. This wasn't just a murder, it was a frenzied, merciless attack. Her torso, arms, and neck were marred with stab wounds, each one a testament to the sheer violence of the crime. By the time the final count was made, the number was staggering, over 50 knife wounds. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. In this documentary film, we will examine real photos and investigate the case related to Crystal Perry, who was born on August 23, 1963, in the quiet, working-class town of Rumford, Maine. Crystal was the youngest of 10 children, born into a family that struggled to make ends meet. Her parents worked tirelessly, stretching every penny to feed and clothe their large brood. With so many mouths to feed, individual attention was a luxury, and discipline was strict but necessary. Her eldest sister, 12 years her senior, took on the role of a second mother, tending to the younger ones with the patience and care of someone far beyond her years. She made sure they were fed, helped them with schoolwork, and did her best to provide comfort in a house where exhaustion often took precedence over affection. Despite the love between siblings, growing up in a home packed with 10 children bred a yearning for independence in each of them. As they grew older, one by one, they left, scattering across different cities and states in search of their own futures. Crystal, too, longed for a life of her own, one where she could finally feel like she belonged to herself. In high school, she met Tom, a boy who, at the time, seemed like her escape. They fell into an easy romance, one filled with young love's typical dreams of forever. Not long after graduating, they married and moved to California, seeking the allure of a fresh start and the promises of a bigger life. After a year and a half, she and Tom made the decision to return home, seeking comfort in the familiar quiet of Maine. They settled in a small town called Bridgeton, an idyllic place often blanketed in the eerie mist that had inspired Stephen King's famous novel. Crystal found work at a local shoe store, and Tom picked up various odd jobs, doing what he could to contribute. Life in Bridgeton was modest, but for a time, it was good. Crystal soon discovered she was pregnant, and with that news came a renewed sense of purpose. In the months that followed, she imagined a future where she could give her child everything she had once longed for. When their daughter Sarah was born, Crystal felt an overwhelming sense of joy. She finally had something that was truly her own. However, the happiness was short-lived. While Tom had initially been enthusiastic about becoming a father, the reality of responsibility weighed on him. His once affectionate nature began to change, and he spent more and more time at the local bar, drowning his frustrations in alcohol. It wasn't long before his drinking turned into something darker. The money they earned was barely enough to support their family, yet Tom squandered it on booze, leaving Crystal to scrape together whatever she could for food and bills. There were nights when there was no money at all, when she would go to bed hungry, making sure Sarah had enough to eat. The final straw came when Tom stole the money she had set aside for groceries, leaving her in tears, forced to ask for help just to get by. With each passing day, the man she had married became a stranger, and Crystal knew she couldn't raise her daughter in such instability. With quiet resolve, she filed for divorce. Though Tom continued to see Sarah from time to time, his presence in her life was sporadic at best. But Crystal's troubles didn't end with the divorce. Tom's new girlfriend became fixated on her, seemingly unable to accept that Crystal had once been part of his life. The harassment began with angry phone calls, words laced with venom and jealousy. Then came the unannounced visits, showing up at Crystal's house, causing scenes, shouting accusations. It escalated into threats, ones that Crystal couldn't ignore. She feared not just for herself, but for Sarah. She worried about what might happen if Sarah spent time at her father's place. What if this woman's jealousy turned to violence? The thought alone kept her awake at night. Determined to give Sarah a better life, Crystal worked hard, saving every extra penny she could. Eventually, she was able to buy a small house on the outskirts of Bridgeton, a modest but beautiful home nestled near a picturesque lake, surrounded by a thick forest. It was peaceful, almost like a dream come true. This house was hers, something she had earned, something no one could take from her. For Crystal, who had grown up in a crowded home with little space of her own, the solitude was a gift. For Sarah, it was a place where she could feel safe, loved, and cherished. May 10, 1994, was a night like any other. Crystal and Sarah watched a solar eclipse together, marveling at the way the sky darkened in the middle of the day. They laughed, made wishes, and then returned home, enjoying a quiet evening together. The next day followed its usual rhythm. Crystal went to work, Sarah attended school, and they later shared dinner, just like they always did. When it was time for bed, Crystal tucked Sarah in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Good night, sweetheart." It was a moment Sarah would never forget. In the dead of night, Sarah was jolted awake by a piercing scream. At first, in her sleepy haze, she thought her mother was arguing with someone on the phone. But as her mind cleared, she realized the screams were raw, desperate, filled with terror. Her heart pounded as she crept toward the slightly open door of her bedroom. The sounds were coming from the kitchen. Though she couldn't see anything from where she stood, the sheer horror in her mother's voice sent chills through her. Then, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. A cold wave of fear washed over her. Someone was in the house. Someone was hurting her mother. Frozen, Sarah barely breathed, terrified that any movement would bring the intruder toward her. She hid behind the bed, waiting for her door to swing open at any moment. But instead, she heard the kitchen drawer open, followed by a sound like someone was rummaging through the silverware. The horrific silence that followed was even more terrifying than the screams. Despite being just 12 years old, Sarah understood with chilling clarity that an unknown intruder had murdered her mother. She wanted to rush to her mother's side, to somehow stop the murder, but sheer terror gripped her body, rendering her unable to move. Her mind screamed at her to act, to do something, but her instincts warned her that confronting the knife-wielding assailant would only lead to her own death. Minutes passed in complete stillness. Sarah remained frozen, listening intently for any sound that might indicate the intruder's next move. Would they come for her? Would they search the house for other victims? But nothing came. The house was eerily silent. The absence of movement sent a shiver down her spine, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled her chest. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, Sarah finally mustered the strength to move. Step by step, she left the relative safety of her bedroom and cautiously made her way toward the kitchen. The lights were off, the only illumination coming from the moonlight streaming through the window. As she stepped forward, her eyes instinctively flicked to the clock on the wall. It read exactly 1 a.m. Then she saw her mother. Crystal's lifeless body lay sprawled across the kitchen floor in a massive pool of red blood. The sheer amount was staggering, almost surreal, and for a moment, Sarah felt like she might pass out. She wanted to believe this was a nightmare, that she would wake up any moment, safe and warm in her bed. She had to get help. Her trembling gaze landed on the telephone receiver, lying just inches from her mother's outstretched fingers. She lunged for it, barely able to breathe as she pressed the numbers for 911. But as she held the phone to her ear, there was only silence. No dial tone, no operator. Desperate, she ran to her mother's bedroom, where the second phone was. She snatched it up and dialed again, but the result was the same. Sarah realized she had only one option left. She needed to find help in person. Without wasting another second, she bolted out of the house into the cold night air. Dressed only in her thin pajamas and barefoot against the damp ground, she sprinted down the road. She pounded on the first door she reached, but no one answered. Frantic, she moved to the next house, then another. Still no response. The town felt like a ghostly void. Then finally, a glimmer of hope. She spotted an Italian restaurant in the distance, its windows still faintly illuminated. The owners lived in the attached building. With what little energy she had left, she ran to their door and knocked frantically. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing the stunned and concerned faces of the restaurant owners. Sarah barely managed to get the words out. Someone had attacked her mother. The weight of her terror and exhaustion made her legs buckle, but the couple caught her, pulling her inside. They wasted no time in calling 911 themselves. Within minutes, sirens pierced the quiet night as police officers arrived at Crystal's home. The moment they stepped inside, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood covered nearly every surface: the floor, the counters, the walls. It was as if the entire kitchen had been painted in crimson. Crystal was long gone, and even the most seasoned medical professionals could tell at a glance that she had stood no chance. Even if paramedics had arrived within minutes, the sheer amount of blood loss had made survival impossible. Investigators immediately began combing through the crime scene. A palm print was found on the front door's glass, but initial analysis suggested it belonged to Sarah. Oddly, there were no other fingerprints anywhere. No evidence of the killer's identity left behind. However, a discovery in the kitchen sent a chill through the officers. A series of shoe prints, clearly imprinted in blood, trailed across the floor. They were of varying sizes and angles, indicating movement, hesitation. They led toward Sarah's bedroom, only to stop short and turn back. For some reason, the murderer had decided against entering. An even stranger detail emerged as detectives surveyed the scene further. It appeared that the killer had made a futile attempt to clean up some of the blood. But with the entire kitchen soaked in it, their efforts were largely ineffective. The most puzzling clue was the blood spatter pattern itself. Most of the droplets had landed at an angle, as though flung from a weapon, likely the knife used to kill Crystal. But some drops had a different trajectory. They had fallen straight down, perfectly vertical from a greater height. The implications were chilling. Investigators theorized that the killer had been injured during the attack. The presence of these drops leading to an empty roll of paper towels suggested that the perpetrator had attempted to stop their own bleeding before fleeing the scene. The crime scene medical experts conducted a meticulous examination of Crystal's body, uncovering a staggering and brutal reality. Over 50 stab wounds covered her torso, arms, and neck. The sheer number of wounds indicated excessive rage, a crime of passion or an act committed by someone deeply unhinged. Despite their exhaustive search, detectives were unable to locate the murder weapon at the crime scene. This immediately led them to believe that the perpetrator had taken the knife with them, either as a twisted keepsake or to dispose of it elsewhere. Experts, based on the nature of the wounds and the broken fragment, concluded that the weapon had been a standard kitchen knife, likely one from Crystal's own home. While combing through the evidence, forensic specialists made a crucial discovery: samples of the perpetrator's DNA found on the body, alongside the scattered blood droplets that did not belong to Crystal. These samples were immediately sent to the lab for DNA analysis, but there was a significant setback. Due to budget constraints and severe backlog, the local forensic laboratory was overwhelmed with cases, meaning the test results wouldn't be available for at least 6 months. This delay forced the detectives to launch their investigation without the benefit of forensic confirmation, relying instead on intuition, circumstantial evidence, and methodical detective work. The first avenue of investigation was to rule out robbery. However, a quick assessment revealed that nothing was missing from the house. Valuables remained untouched, and the home showed no signs of forced entry. This led detectives to believe that Crystal had willingly opened the door for her killer. Considering that she was in her pajamas, it was unlikely that she had been expecting visitors at such a late hour. Investigators theorized that the murderer was either someone Crystal knew personally or a stranger who had managed to deceive her into letting them in under false pretenses. With no immediate suspect in mind, detectives turned their attention to the only witness, Sarah. The traumatized 12-year-old had been taken to the hospital for evaluation, and it was there that investigators questioned her. They first asked why she had chosen to run to the neighbors rather than call 911 from inside the house. Sarah explained that both household phones weren't working, an answer that raised suspicion among the officers. Upon inspecting the crime scene, detectives tested both phones and found them in working condition, making successful calls without issue. The questioning then shifted focus to the crime itself. Did Sarah see the killer? She maintained that she had not left her bedroom until it was all over. However, the investigators remained skeptical. How then had she immediately concluded that her mother had been attacked with a knife? Sarah insisted that it had simply been obvious from the sounds she had heard, but detectives weren't convinced. They suspected she might be withholding vital information out of fear or trauma. Over the next 3 days, Sarah was subjected to relentless interrogation, questioned a total of 18 times in the hopes that her story would change, or that she would reveal some overlooked detail. Yet, her account remained unchanged. Frustrated but determined, investigators shifted their attention to other leads. A breakthrough came when detectives discovered a pair of boots at a local shoe store, their distinctive sole pattern matching the bloody footprints found in Crystal's kitchen. This clue ignited new avenues of inquiry, but the question remained: who owned the boots? At the same time, police uncovered another lead. Crystal had been the target of persistent harassment from Teresa, the girlfriend of her ex-husband, Tom. Teresa had made multiple threats against Crystal, openly expressing her hostility. Despite the killer being evidently male, detectives still pursued this lead, suspecting that Teresa may have enlisted someone to carry out the crime on her behalf. Yet, after exhaustive interviews and surveillance, they found no direct evidence linking Teresa to the murder. Shifting their focus once again, investigators turned their attention to Crystal's recent romantic relationship. At the time of her death, she had been involved with a man named Dennis, whom she had met 2 years prior when he started working at the shoe store. Their relationship had progressed quickly, leading to Dennis proposing marriage. Crystal had accepted, but for reasons unknown, the wedding never took place. It soon became evident that their relationship had been tumultuous. Friends and colleagues reported that Crystal and Dennis frequently argued, and his temper was unpredictable. He had a history of breaking things in fits of rage, punching walls, slamming doors. But there were no reports of him ever physically harming Crystal. Still, his explosive temperament made him a person of interest. The day after Crystal's murder, detectives visited Dennis at his home. When he opened the door, they wasted no time with pleasantries. They asked him outright if he had left his house the night before and whether he had seen Crystal. His reaction was immediate and unsettling. Rather than responding, Dennis's face drained of color, and before he could utter a word, he collapsed onto the floor in apparent shock. Once he regained consciousness, he agreed to answer their questions. In a shaky voice, he admitted that he had indeed planned to visit Crystal that evening. However, he claimed that he had gotten delayed after work while helping a friend fix a car. Upon returning home that night, Dennis called Crystal, hoping to see her, but she told him it was too late. This seemingly small exchange quickly turned into an argument. Dennis, frustrated, stayed home, brooding over their ongoing tensions. He later admitted to the police that their fights had been escalating lately, but he maintained that he would never hurt her. The police were unable to completely verify Dennis's alibi, but they did confirm that he had, in fact, spent the evening helping his friend repair a car. Still, detectives remained skeptical. Dennis agreed to take a polygraph test, and for the most part, the results indicated truthfulness. However, one response stood out. When asked if he felt responsible for Crystal's death, Dennis firmly answered no, but the examiner detected signs of stress. This anomaly, combined with his proximity to the victim, only deepened investigators' suspicions. Adding to the intrigue, detectives noted that Dennis's shoe size matched that of the footprints found at the crime scene, though they found no corresponding footwear in his home. When asked to provide a DNA sample, he readily complied but made an unusual request. He asked detectives for a personal favor. If they ever decided to arrest him, they should come to his workplace through the back door rather than making a scene. He explained that he respected his employer and didn't want to disrupt the business. Considering he adamantly maintained his innocence, this request struck detectives as odd and preemptive. As they continued to dig, investigators discovered something alarming. They contacted Crystal's best friend, who lived in another town, and learned that Crystal had confided in her just weeks before the murder. Crystal had expressed growing fear of Dennis, telling her friend that their arguments were becoming increasingly heated and his temper was worsening. She had even considered ending the relationship, but worried about how he would react. The police then turned to Crystal's colleagues, hoping for additional insight. One coworker didn't provide any immediately useful information during her interview, but something suspicious happened afterward. Shortly after the detectives left, Dennis showed up at her workplace and began pressing her for details about what she had told the police. This behavior further fueled suspicions, yet without concrete evidence, detectives could do little but continue their search. As weeks passed, another unexpected lead surfaced. A man named Donnie, known for his heavy drinking and tendency to fabricate stories, had been overheard at a party boasting about killing Crystal. Witnesses reported that he was heavily intoxicated when he made the statement. When police brought him in for questioning, Donnie claimed to have no memory of the party or the alleged confession and vehemently denied any involvement in the murder. His reputation as an unreliable source made it difficult to determine whether his claims were true or merely drunken bravado. Ultimately, investigators had to let him go due to a lack of evidence. Meanwhile, another tip came in about a black pickup truck with New Hampshire plates that had been seen near Crystal's home on the night of the murder. The police chased this lead, but it led nowhere. No one could definitively link the vehicle to the crime. In yet another bizarre twist, a woman reported that on the night of the murder, she had been driving past Crystal's house when she heard sirens. Believing they were headed for her boyfriend, who had a history of legal troubles, she kept an eye on the road. That's when she noticed a car tailing her aggressively with its high beams on. Feeling chased, she took a sudden turn onto another road, but the car sped past instead of following her. Although the police considered the possibility that this car could have been linked to the crime, they were never able to verify a connection. With no solid leads, Crystal's family decided to take matters into their own hands. Pooling their resources, they raised $10,000 as a reward for any information leading to an arrest. Flyers were distributed all over town, pleading for witnesses to come forward. But soon, an unsettling development arose. Teresa, the girlfriend of Crystal's ex-husband Tom, was seen tearing down the flyers multiple times. Given Teresa's past animosity toward Crystal, detectives briefly revisited the possibility that she was involved. However, Tom was also thoroughly investigated, and his deteriorating alcoholism cast doubt on his ability to commit such a calculated crime. Additionally, there was no clear motive linking him to the crime. Police also investigated 2 other men Crystal had dated after her divorce, but neither yielded any substantial leads. To ensure they left no stone unturned, all potential suspects, including Tom, voluntarily submitted DNA samples. The department anxiously awaited the forensic results, hoping for a breakthrough. 9 months after Crystal's murder, investigators finally received the much-anticipated DNA results. But the findings left them with more questions than answers. The blood and semen samples collected from the crime scene did not match any of the primary suspects. Not Dennis, not Tom, not Donnie, and not any of Crystal's former partners. The results only deepened the mystery, eliminating every suspect they had considered viable. Detectives, still harboring suspicions about Dennis, requested another DNA sample from him for additional testing. Yet once again, the results were conclusive. He was not the perpetrator. Staring at a dead end, the police were left with only one potential source of new information: Sarah. They still assumed that either she was lying to them or her mind had blocked out the horrific memories of her mother's murder, and she actually saw the killer. At that time, Sarah was living with her aunt in Texas, far from the small town where her mother had been brutally murdered. The police, determined to find any lingering details that might help them crack the case, traveled across the country to speak with her in person. Upon arriving, they subjected Sarah to a polygraph test, hoping it would reveal inconsistencies in her previous statements. However, the results showed no signs of deception. Still, investigators weren't entirely convinced. They continued questioning her day after day, relentlessly pressing her for any small detail she might have missed. Every time, Sarah maintained her stance. She had not seen the killer. Frustrated but left with no choice, the detectives eventually had to accept her response and move forward. With no new breakthroughs, the case went cold, remaining unsolved for years. Despite the lack of progress, law enforcement never stopped searching for Crystal's murderer. They interviewed countless people, reevaluated old suspects, and followed every lead, no matter how insignificant it seemed. But every effort led to a dead end. Hope dwindled, and Crystal's family, especially Sarah, was left with no closure. Then, in the late 1990s, a significant technological advancement changed the course of criminal investigations. The FBI's DNA database became operational. Detectives immediately uploaded the DNA sample collected from Crystal's crime scene, eagerly awaiting a match. Yet, to their disappointment, no results came back. Years passed, and with each passing day, the case grew colder. In 1999, however, a fresh perspective emerged when a new detective was assigned to the case. Determined to uncover the truth, he took a more aggressive approach. He not only reviewed every piece of existing evidence, but also devised a new plan. He would collect as many DNA samples as possible from men living in the town and nearby areas. By that time, forensic technology had advanced significantly, making it possible to process tests much faster. The police gathered hundreds of samples, methodically eliminating suspects one by one. But despite their best efforts, none of them matched the DNA found at the crime scene. Refusing to give up, the detective reached out to Sarah and encouraged her to work with a psychologist specializing in memory retrieval. The hope was that suppressed memories, buried by trauma, might resurface. Sarah agreed to undergo the process. After multiple sessions, the psychologist concluded that Sarah was telling the truth. She had genuinely blocked out the memory and could not recall any additional details about the killer. Once again, the investigation reached a dead end. For years, the case remained dormant, with detectives occasionally revisiting it, but finding no new leads. Then, in 2006, an unexpected breakthrough occurred. Investigators received an alert from the FBI database. Finally, after more than a decade, a DNA match had been found. The profile belonged to a man named Michael Hutchinson, someone who had never even been considered a suspect. Detectives quickly dug into his background. They discovered that in 2003, Michael had been arrested for assault and for making threats with a weapon. He had served 6 months in prison and was placed on 3 years of probation. As part of his arrest, a DNA sample was taken, but due to an administrative failure, it was never uploaded to the national database. It had sat in a forensic lab for years, unnoticed and unprocessed. Then, 3 years later, in 2006, Michael was arrested again, this time for driving under the influence with his children in the car. He was released on bail but failed to appear in court, leading to an immediate warrant for his arrest. Police eventually caught up with him, at his own wedding. As per standard procedure, he was placed in custody, and another DNA sample was collected. This time, the sample was uploaded promptly, and within days, it was matched to the DNA found at Crystal's crime scene. The lead detective on Crystal's case immediately contacted Sarah, informing her of the discovery. However, he urged her to keep the information confidential until the authorities were ready to move forward with formal charges. He then asked a critical question. Did she know Michael Hutchinson? Sarah thought carefully, but ultimately answered no. She had never heard of him. With Michael already incarcerated, the detective methodically built the case against him, ensuring that the evidence was airtight. He learned that at the time of Crystal's murder, Michael had been living in Bridgeton, just 2 miles away from her home. At 19 years old, he had been a frequent presence in the area, regularly passing by Crystal's house on his way to visit his mother. His daily routine placed him near the scene of the crime multiple times, making it plausible that he had noticed Crystal and developed an unhealthy fixation on her. When the detective visited Michael in prison to confront him about the murder, the suspect remained defiant. He flatly denied any involvement, claiming that he had never met Crystal in his life. But the forensic evidence was damning. His semen had been found on Crystal's body, and his blood had been discovered at the crime scene. When asked how he could explain this, Michael had no response. During the interview, the detective made another key observation. Michael had a large scar on his palm. This seemingly minor detail was significant because investigators had long believed that Crystal's killer had injured himself during the attack. While the scar itself wasn't irrefutable proof, it further strengthened the case against him. Eventually, with overwhelming DNA evidence, Michael was formally charged with Crystal's murder. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of what had likely happened that night. The night of the attack, he decided to strike, breaking into her home with intent. While he refused to confess and the exact details of the crime remained unknown, the evidence was indisputable. Michael had assaulted and brutally murdered Crystal. During the trial, a long-standing mystery was finally explained: how Michael had managed to avoid leaving a single fingerprint at the crime scene. The answer was unexpected, yet logical. Michael had spent years working as a bricklayer, and due to the nature of the work, the ridges on his fingertips had gradually worn down. This meant that even if he had touched multiple surfaces at the scene, he physically could not leave distinct fingerprints. This revelation, though fascinating, did little to help his defense. Instead, it only strengthened the prosecution's argument that he had committed the crime with the knowledge that he wouldn't leave behind any incriminating prints. In an attempt to save himself, Michael provided his own version of events, spinning a tale that defied logic. He claimed that on the night of the murder, he met Crystal at a local bar. According to him, they had drinks together and later went back to her home. At some point, he alleged, a masked man dressed in a black motorcycle jacket barged into the house. This mysterious assailant, he claimed, knocked him unconscious and proceeded to murder Crystal. When Michael regained consciousness, he insisted that he attempted to fight off the attacker but was wounded in the hand before the man fled. Instead of calling for help or alerting authorities, Michael admitted that he also left the crime scene without any reasonable explanation. His story was riddled with inconsistencies, and the prosecution quickly tore it apart. Firstly, the only shoe prints found at the crime scene belonged to Michael. If another man had entered the house, it would mean that he had done so barefoot, an absurd and highly unlikely notion. Secondly, despite Michael's claims, there wasn't a single witness who could corroborate his story. No one at the bar remembered seeing him with Crystal that night, casting further doubt on his account. The trial reached its conclusion on April 9, 2007. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning a unanimous verdict. Michael Hutchinson was found guilty on all charges. The judge handed down the harshest possible sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. On August 7, 2016, in a remote rural area near Scone, two unsuspecting pedestrians came across a disturbing sight. Hidden among the dense bushes, just a few feet from the road, was a shallow grave. What they found inside sent a chill down their spines: human remains. Authorities swiftly arrived at the scene, sealing off the area as forensic experts began their meticulous examination. DNA testing and other forensic analyses soon confirmed the devastating truth. The remains belonged to Carly McBride, a mother of two from Belmont who had vanished without a trace on September 30th, 2014. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Today, we will explore a real and chilling crime that happened to Carly McBride, who was born on April 14, 1983, to Steve McBride and Lorraine Williams in New South Wales, Australia. From an early age, Carly displayed an infectious energy, a vibrant personality, and an ever-present smile. She was a bright and outgoing child, forming strong bonds with her parents and those around her. She grew up in a loving household, but as she transitioned into adolescence and adulthood, she began to encounter difficulties that led her down a troubling path. As she entered her teenage years, Carly started facing personal struggles that began to shape the course of her life. She turned to alcohol and illegal substances, a decision that would eventually take a toll on her well-being. Despite these struggles, Carly showed incredible resilience and an enduring desire to overcome her addiction. She sought help multiple times, demonstrating her determination to regain control of her life. In 2013, at the age of 30, she made a significant step forward by checking herself into a rehabilitation center to combat her addiction. It was there that she met Sale Kenneth Newson, a man who would soon become an integral part of her life. What started as a casual friendship quickly blossomed into a deeper relationship, and by August 2014, Carly and Sale were nearly inseparable. By 2014, Carly was a 31-year-old mother of 2 young children, 7-year-old William and 3-year-old Cadence. She lived in Belmont, New South Wales, and was making efforts to rebuild her life for herself and her children. Though Carly and Sale's relationship had its ups and downs, outwardly, they appeared to be happy together. However, those close to Carly noted occasional conflicts between the couple, though nothing seemed out of the ordinary. On September 30, 2014, what seemed like an ordinary day soon took a tragic turn. Carly had planned to visit her daughter Cadence, who lived in Muswell Brook with her father, Andrew Easton. Sale agreed to drive Carly to Andrew's home, where she intended to spend a few hours with her child. At approximately 12:30 p.m., Sale dropped Carly off outside Andrew's house. As always, he expected Carly to call or text him to let him know she was okay and when she was ready to be picked up. However, that day, things played out differently. When Sale returned a few hours later to pick her up as planned, Carly was nowhere to be found. Andrew Easton claimed that he and Carly had an argument, leading her to leave his home on foot. According to Andrew, Carly told him she was heading to the nearest McDonald's, a 20-minute walk from his house. But something seemed amiss. Carly hadn't contacted Sale to inform him of her whereabouts, which was out of character. Concerned, Sale repeatedly tried to call her, but his calls went unanswered. Assuming her phone had died, he began driving toward McDonald's, keeping a watchful eye on the streets in hopes of spotting her. However, there was no sign of Carly anywhere. She wasn't at McDonald's or on any of the roads leading to it. As his worry deepened, Sale continued searching, driving through Muswell Brook streets, hoping to find Carly sitting on a bench, standing by the roadside, or walking in the direction of their home. But with each passing minute, it became clearer that she had disappeared without a trace. When she failed to return to their home in Belmont that evening, Sale knew something was wrong. He contacted the police to report her missing. Investigators quickly began piecing together the last known movements of Carly McBride. They questioned Sale, who recounted the usual routine of their visits to Cadence. It would be exactly the same thing every time, Sale explained. I would drop her off. She would get out of the car, go to the front door, pick up her daughter in her arms, and then turn around to wave me off. She would always call me twice and text me twice during every visit just to let me know she was okay. But that day, I dropped her off at about 12:30 p.m., and things were different. I never heard from her again. Not a single text, not a single call. I tried to reach her, but her phone just went silent. Detectives then turned their focus to Andrew Easton, the last known person to see Carly McBride alive. Andrew initially told police that he and Carly had engaged in a heated argument that afternoon, which ultimately led to her storming out of his house on foot. According to him, she had intended to walk to a nearby McDonald's. However, this statement quickly came under scrutiny as investigators probed deeper into the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. A crucial question arose. Had Carly truly left Andrew's house that day, or was he deliberately withholding key details? While Andrew's version of events suggested she had willingly departed after their disagreement, there were no eyewitnesses to substantiate his claim. Not a single neighbor had seen her leaving, nor did any pedestrians or drivers recall spotting her along the supposed route to McDonald's. This inconsistency immediately raised a red flag. Determined to verify Andrew's account, police canvassed the area extensively, conducting interviews with residents, local businesses, and anyone who might have been in the vicinity that day. They also carefully examined all possible pathways she might have taken. Strangely, despite their diligent efforts, no one reported seeing Carly walking in the direction of the fast food restaurant, or anywhere else for that matter. The absence of sightings only deepened suspicions about Andrew's statement. Complicating matters further was the lack of surveillance footage. Investigators reviewed security camera recordings from homes, businesses, and traffic intersections along the route, but they found no evidence that Carly had ever been on foot in the area that day. Even more unsettling was the fact that Andrew's house was located in a section of town with limited security camera coverage, making it difficult to determine if Carly had left when he claimed she did. With growing doubts, investigators expanded their search to McDonald's itself, meticulously reviewing hours of surveillance footage from inside and around the restaurant. They were hoping to confirm whether Carly had arrived there at any point. However, after a painstaking analysis of the recordings, the results were conclusive. Carly never showed up. It was as if she had disappeared without a trace, her presence seemingly erased from the world the moment she stepped outside. With mounting concerns about Carly's whereabouts, authorities conducted a thorough search of the surrounding areas, including the fields and wooded patches behind a nearby residential area. Despite these exhaustive measures, no significant evidence was found to indicate where she had gone or what might have happened to her. A lead investigator on the case later stated, "At this stage, we haven't located any clear signs of foul play, but the circumstances of Carly's disappearance are deeply troubling. We are urging the public to come forward with any relevant information. If you saw Carly McBride that day, or if you have any knowledge regarding her movements, please contact law enforcement immediately." Carly McBride was last seen wearing blue jeans, sandals, a yellow t-shirt, and carrying a tan handbag. Her sudden and inexplicable vanishing left her family desperate for answers, and the police determined to uncover the truth. After securing a search warrant, law enforcement officials arrived at Andrew Easton's home, the last place Carly had been seen alive. A team of forensic experts and police officers meticulously examined the residence, combing through every room, surface, and object in hopes of uncovering a clue that could shed light on Carly's fate. They searched for signs of a struggle, traces of blood, or any other physical evidence that might suggest foul play. However, despite their thorough efforts, nothing immediately stood out. There were no apparent signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no items out of place that hinted at a confrontation gone wrong. Yet, the lack of physical evidence did not mean there was no cause for suspicion. As investigators dug deeper, they stumbled upon a troubling digital trail. Carly's Facebook account had been mysteriously deleted just hours after she went missing, before her disappearance had even been reported. This disturbing revelation posed serious questions. Had Carly deleted her own account, or had someone else accessed it? Was this merely a strange coincidence, or was it an intentional act designed to erase digital evidence of a crime? Police immediately pursued this lead, theorizing that Carly's social media activity could hold critical clues. Investigators speculated that her Facebook messages might contain significant information, perhaps conversations with someone who knew what had happened to her, or messages revealing a conflict, a secret meeting, or a distress signal sent in desperation. Determined to retrieve the missing data, authorities reached out to the U.S. Department of Justice, requesting assistance in recovering Carly's deleted social media interactions and identifying who had accessed her account last. Since Facebook's data analysis and security operations were headquartered in Menlo Park, California, officials believed this approach could yield crucial leads. Sergeant Wright, a senior detective on the case, underscored the importance of digital evidence. "We are particularly concerned about the timing of Carly's Facebook account deletion. It is highly suspicious and could be a key factor in understanding what happened to her. We are appealing to anyone who may have interacted with Carly online before her disappearance. If you exchanged messages with her, noticed anything unusual, or came across suspicious activity on her profile, please come forward. Any detail, no matter how small, could be the missing piece we need," said Sergeant Wright. Many said that she simply decided to leave and start a new life. Carly's family and friends strongly refuted any suggestion that she had voluntarily vanished to start a new life. Her close friend and flatmate Kylie Smith vividly recalled her last conversation with Carly as she traveled to Muswell Brook. "She was so down to earth. I would call her a free spirit. She was easygoing and she just loved life," Kylie said. "She was the kind of person who always knew if you were having a bad day and would check in with you. She cared deeply about her friends and family. The idea that she would just disappear without a trace? It doesn't make sense." Kylie made an emotional plea to the public, urging anyone with information to come forward. "We wake up every day not knowing what happened, not knowing where she is," she said. "Someone out there knows something. You have to have a conscience. Please, come forward with any news, no matter how small. Just give us something." The police conducted exhaustive searches of the area where Carly had last been seen. Search teams used trained dogs to scour the surroundings. Police divers meticulously examined the depths of the Hunter River, and aerial surveillance combined with trail bike patrols covered vast stretches of terrain. Yet, despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Carly was found. As weeks turned into months, The lack of new evidence caused frustration and heartbreak. Carly's digital footprint remained eerily silent. Her phone was never turned on again. Her social media accounts showed no activity, and she hadn't accessed her bank accounts. Investigators began to fear the worst, that Carly McBride was no longer alive. 9 months passed without answers, and yet, Carly's parents refused to give up hope. Steve McBride and Lorraine Williams continued their relentless search for their missing daughter, appealing to the public for any information. They were joined by Detective Timothy Seymour, who encouraged citizens to come forward with even the smallest pieces of information that might assist in the case. During an emotional public appeal, Carly's mother, Lorraine, fought back tears as she begged for answers. "Our family is suffering. We just need to know what happened to our daughter." The impact of Carly's disappearance had deeply affected her family, with Steve McBride describing the emotional and logistical difficulties they faced. "We are coping the best we can," he said. As for Carly's children, it's a complex situation. Both of her kids have different fathers, and unfortunately, we haven't had as much contact with them as we'd like. We just hope that changes so we can be more present in their lives. Detective Inspector Timothy Seymour assured the public that the case remained a priority and that law enforcement officers had worked tirelessly to find the missing woman. "We have a plethora of information that we are sorting through. However, we are still appealing for more help," Inspector Seymour stated. As time passed, Carly's parents began to accept the harrowing reality that they might never see their beloved daughter alive again. The pain of uncertainty weighed heavily on their hearts, and Lorraine, Carly's mother, put her pain into words in a deeply emotional letter addressed to the man responsible for her daughter's abduction. "I don't believe there is a single soul who does not now know what happened to my bub, or hasn't sensed the pain we are living with every single day. They will never again feel her soft, reassuring kisses or be wrapped in her warm, comforting hugs. They will never hear that big, contagious belly laugh or see her radiant, loving smile. Their memories are fading, lost in the passage of time, and they never had the chance to say goodbye. The pain, the anguish, the frustration. We wake up every day with our hearts burdened by the hope that today might be the day we receive a call. The call that tells us they have found my girl. This is my only wish. That find my daughter, that we can finally lay her to rest." Despite their best efforts, police were unable to establish any direct link between Carly's disappearance and her ex-partner, Andrew Easton. With Easton seemingly ruled out, investigators turned their attention to another potential suspect, Sale Newson, Carly's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. The deeper they dug into their relationship, the more they uncovered troubling details that painted a picture far removed from the loving partnership Newson claimed to have had with Carly. Although Newson publicly professed deep love and devotion for Carly, describing her as the first woman he had truly loved in 14 years, their relationship was marred by jealousy and frequent arguments. Investigators learned that Newson was intensely possessive, and his insecurities often led to heated disputes. 2 days before Carly went missing, they had fought over Facebook messages she allegedly received from other men. To the public, Newson presented himself as a distraught and inconsolable partner, tirelessly searching for Carly. He launched a Facebook page, participated in awareness campaigns, offered financial rewards for information, and knocked on doors in the area where she was last seen. But beneath this facade, his actions told a different story. Within hours of reporting Carly missing, Newson communicated with several women. Just 2 days after her disappearance, on October 2, he spent the night with another woman. His actions directly contradicted his public display of grief, raising further suspicions. But while these details painted an unflattering picture of Newson's character, they remained circumstantial. The police needed direct evidence to bring formal charges against him. Determined to find answers, authorities intensified their investigation. In April 2015, police conducted searches at 3 different properties, one in Muswellbrook and 2 in Scone, a town located approximately 15 miles from Muswellbrook in the Upper Hunter Shire. During these searches, officers seized 3 firearms and an undisclosed quantity of illegal substances. A 24-year-old man named James Caneen was arrested in connection with the seized items. Although the police clarified that the charges against Caneen were unrelated to Carly's case, the fact that his name surfaced during the investigation raised questions. Could he have had some connection to her disappearance? Or was it merely an unrelated coincidence? The case remained at a frustrating standstill. Nearly 2 years passed with no significant breakthroughs. Carly's family continued to suffer, their agony only worsening with time. Detectives remained committed to the case but had no fresh leads, until an unexpected discovery changed everything. On August 7, 2016, in a remote rural area near Scone, two pedestrians made a grim and unsettling discovery. As they walked along a secluded path, their eyes caught sight of something unusual. A shallow grave partially concealed among dense bushes, mere feet away from the roadside. Curiosity quickly turned to horror as they realized what lay within. Inside the shallow pit were human remains, their presence masked by time and the elements. Authorities rushed to the scene, their arrival marking the beginning of what would become a complex and emotionally charged investigation. Forensic experts meticulously combed through the site, collecting every trace of evidence that might shed light on the identity of the deceased. Their analysis soon delivered devastating confirmation. The remains belonged to Carly McBride, the young mother of two from Belmont who had vanished without a trace nearly 2 years prior, on September 30th, 2014. Law enforcement officers, aware of the gravity of this breakthrough, made a calculated decision to withhold the announcement for 4 days. They hoped that by delaying the public revelation, they could gather additional crucial evidence before alerting potential suspects. Once they were confident in their preliminary findings, Intendant Guyana addressed the gathered press outside the Scone police station. His solemn expression reflected the weight of the investigation. "We do not believe that this was a random act," he declared firmly. Carly's disappearance and murder were not coincidental. We are thoroughly examining her past, her acquaintances, and every individual who may have played a role in the tragic events that led to her death. Despite the bold statement, Intendant Guyana remained cautious. He refrained from naming any suspects, reiterating that while the discovery was a major milestone, the investigation was still in its early stages. Detectives continued to work tirelessly, piecing together a puzzle that had remained unsolved for far too long. For the lead investigator on the case, the breakthrough was the result of years of relentless determination and unwavering commitment. "It has taken us 2 years to reach this point, and we now have an extensive and compelling volume of fresh evidence that demands careful examination," he stated during a press briefing. "Over the past 2 years, our dedicated team has spared no effort in uncovering the truth behind Carly's disappearance. We are determined to solve this case and bring closure to her family. The new evidence we've obtained is substantial, and while it will take time to process and analyze, we are already making significant progress." Carly's devastated parents, Steve McBride and Lorraine Williams, stood before the cameras, their anguish palpable. Although the discovery of Carly's remains provided her family with a painful semblance of closure, the wound left by her loss remained raw. They were grateful for the unwavering support from law enforcement and the community, yet the lingering question of who was responsible for their daughter's brutal death tormented them. The grief was overwhelming, but their resolve to see justice served only strengthened with time. For nearly 10 months, detectives meticulously sifted through the growing collection of evidence. Their tireless efforts culminated in a decisive moment. An arrest warrant was issued for Sale Newson. On June 19, 2017, law enforcement officers moved swiftly to apprehend him. As Newson was taken into custody and escorted to the station for questioning, he remained steadfast in his denial. He insisted he had no involvement in Carly McBride's tragic death. But Newson was not the only individual under scrutiny. Authorities soon uncovered new leads pointing to 26-year-old James Canine, whom they suspected of assisting Newson in disposing of Carly's body. Canine was subsequently arrested and charged as an accessory after the fact. Investigators uncovered a significant connection between the three individuals, Carly McBride, Sale Newson, and James Canine, who had all crossed paths at a rehabilitation center dedicated to treating alcohol and substance addiction. Although their time at the facility had overlapped only briefly, their connection had extended beyond those walls. Even after their respective departures, they had remained in contact, leading police to suspect that Canine may have played a more active role in the crime than initially assumed. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors faced a formidable challenge. The circumstantial nature of the evidence meant that proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt would require meticulous argumentation and forensic expertise. The trial of Sale Newson officially commenced in August 2018, but the proceedings were anything but swift. Legal delays, procedural complications, and the intricacies of the evidence stretched the case over several years. The prosecution painted a chilling narrative. On the night of Carly's disappearance, they alleged, Newson had arranged to meet with her shortly after she left her ex-partner's home. Driven by jealousy and rage, he launched a brutal attack, repeatedly striking Carly with unrelenting force. The violence left her with catastrophic injuries before she ultimately succumbed to her wounds. Her body was then transported to the remote location. Forensic specialists provided damning testimony, confirming that Carly McBride's cause of death was extensive blunt force trauma. The injuries she sustained were horrifying in their severity. She had suffered 23 fractures to her skull, 13 fractures to her torso, and multiple breaks along her spine and ribs. The presiding judge, upon reviewing the evidence, remarked on the sheer brutality of the attack, describing it as an act of incomprehensible violence. During police interrogations, Newson had boasted about his experience as a mixed martial artist. "My main sport was Thai boxing," he had told investigators. "I had 20 fights and 20 wins. I trained with world champions, but by the time I got really good, I was too old." The court found this statement particularly chilling, given the nature of Carly's fatal injuries. While executing a search warrant at Newson's residence, investigators unearthed a crucial piece of evidence hidden in a shoebox beneath his bed, a hand-drawn map. The map had a circled area encompassing both Muswell Brook and Scone, the very region where Carly's remains were later discovered. Additionally, the map featured 3 numbered locations, with Senior Constable Mohini testifying that 2 of these numbers corresponded to the locations of point-to-point surveillance cameras. Following the discovery of Carly's remains in 2016, Newson made a shocking and revealing phone call to her father, Steve McBride. During this conversation, he mentioned that Carly's skeleton was missing hand bones, an unsettling detail that had never been publicly disclosed by authorities. At the time, only a limited number of individuals had access to this information: the police, Carly's parents, and forensic specialists at the John Hunter Hospital. Investigators became convinced that Newson's knowledge of this fact indicated his direct familiarity with the crime scene, reinforcing their belief that he was responsible for dumping Carly's body in the isolated location where it was eventually found 2 years later. Further reinforcing suspicions, forensic evidence confirmed that the clothes found on Carly's remains matched the ones she had been wearing on the day she went missing. This suggested that she had been killed shortly after leaving her former partner's house, eliminating any possibility that she had disappeared voluntarily. However, key personal belongings, including Carly's purse and mobile phone, were never recovered. Authorities uncovered additional damning evidence while analyzing Newson's digital footprint. When forensic experts examined his mobile phone, they discovered that he had deliberately erased location services data from September 18th to October 2, 2014, a period that spanned Carly's disappearance and its immediate aftermath. Investigators also learned that a photograph of Carly, which Newson had taken while driving her to Muswell Brook, had been altered before it was used in missing person flyers. This suggested a premeditated effort to manipulate details surrounding her last moments. When the search for Carly McBride began, Sale Newson made a public show of offering a $20,000 reward for any information leading to her whereabouts. However, a thorough examination of his financial records revealed that he was, in fact, broke, making it evident that his reward offer was nothing more than an empty gesture. Investigators concluded that he had only made the offer because he knew no one would ever find her, thus ensuring he would never have to pay. From the very start, Newson actively inserted himself into the police investigation, attempting to deflect suspicion onto others while simultaneously gathering information about the movements and strategies of law enforcement. He persistently questioned authorities about where they intended to search next, monitored emergency services activities, and canvassed the surrounding neighborhoods, supposedly looking for CCTV footage or witnesses. However, police became convinced that his true intent was not to aid in the investigation, but to suppress any information that might incriminate him. Authorities believed he was attempting to determine whether anyone had seen him intercept Carly McBride that fateful day. While teams of volunteers and dedicated police officers scoured Muswell Brook, distributing missing person flyers and desperately searching for any trace of Carly, Newson was hundreds of miles away in Sydney. Rather than showing genuine concern for his missing girlfriend, he was instead bragging to friends via text messages about driving an Audi R8. His lack of urgency and apparent detachment from the search efforts only deepened suspicions about his involvement in Carly's disappearance. Another chilling revelation surfaced when Newson confidently claimed to know the exact location where Carly's remains had been found. He described the area in remarkable detail to Carly's father, Steve McBride. However, investigators had deliberately set up a fake crime scene to mislead the media and the public, further confirming that Newson possessed information that only the perpetrator could have known. The deeper investigators probed into Newson's past, the more they unraveled a disturbing pattern of deceit. His online search history painted an alarming picture, as forensic experts discovered that he had specifically searched for information on how to delete a Facebook account. Curiously, his own account remained active while Carly's had been mysteriously deleted shortly after she vanished. This digital footprint, though circumstantial, became another crucial puzzle piece in the prosecution's growing case against him. Despite lacking direct physical evidence, the prosecution methodically pieced together an irrefutable narrative built upon circumstantial evidence. They asserted that Newson, upon picking Carly up from Muswellbrook, became enraged when he learned that she had spent approximately 90 minutes alone with her ex-partner instead of spending time with her daughter as planned. This revelation, driven by his unchecked jealousy, allegedly led him to launch a brutal, unplanned attack on Carly. Forensic reports later confirmed the sheer brutality of the assault. Carly had suffered 23 skull fractures, 13 fractures to her torso, and multiple spinal and rib fractures. The judge concluded that the magnitude of her injuries left no doubt. She had endured an extended and violent beating before succumbing to her wounds. As the trial progressed, Carly's devastated mother, Lorraine Williams, delivered a heartbreaking statement at Newson's sentencing hearing. Through tears, she recounted the torment of waiting for her daughter's return, clinging to hope for 2 agonizing years, only to be met with the horrific reality of identifying her remains in the morgue. Carly should be here, living her life with her children, her sister, her father, and me, Lorraine wept. After today, I never want to hear, speak, or see the man who took my beautiful daughter's life ever again. He no longer has any power to hurt me, and I refuse to waste another moment thinking about him. I will miss Carly for the rest of my life, every second of every day. Nearly 7 years after he first reported Carly missing, 43-year-old Sale Newson was found guilty in December 2021. The judge handed down a severe sentence, 27 years in prison, with parole eligibility in 2038. Yet even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Newson defiantly proclaimed his innocence. In a final plea, he turned to the judge and restated his claims. "I understand the verdict has been given," he said. "Your Honor, I'm innocent. From the moment I reported Carly missing to this very day, I have complied with the police, the courts, and the jails. I have been found guilty of a crime I did not commit. Someone else is responsible for this crime, not me. Now I have a long battle ahead of me to try and clear my name through the courts." In addition to Newson's conviction, his accomplice, James Caneen, was also brought to justice. Investigators determined that Caneen played a direct role in covering up Carly's murder. In July 2022, a jury found Caneen guilty of aiding Newson in the disposal of Carly's remains. The prosecution revealed that Caneen had repeatedly lied during 3 separate police interrogations, fabricating alibis to shield Newson from suspicion. He had also erased data from his phone to eliminate incriminating evidence. Despite the gravity of his crimes, Caneen exhibited little reaction when, in November 2022, the court sentenced him to 7.5 years in prison, with a parole eligibility period of 4 years. His detached demeanor only added to the heartbreak felt by Carly's grieving family, who had endured years of torment in search of justice. Following the trial's conclusion, Carly's parents reflected on the painful reality that, no matter the verdict, no amount of justice would ever bring their beloved daughter back. A normal morning turned into fear. The rancher, accustomed to his routine, had set out to inspect a remote section of his property, a patch of land he rarely visited. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but what he stumbled upon sent a chill down his spine. There, in a clearing, lay what appeared to be a makeshift fire pit. A ring of scorched rocks enclosed a bed of ash and half-burnt fragments. Without wasting another second, he reached for his phone and called the authorities. Within an hour, sheriff's deputies and forensic specialists arrived on the scene, moving swiftly to cordon off the area with yellow crime scene tape. The air grew tense as experts began their careful examination, sifting through the evidence. The preliminary analysis confirmed the rancher's worst fears. Some of the bone fragments were human. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. In this true crime case, we will examine the story of Andreen McDonald, who was born on September 23, 1989, in Jamaica, where from a young age she showed the tenacity and determination that would later help her succeed in business. Her childhood was not always easy. Her family often struggled financially, and Andreen quickly learned to value every opportunity that came her way. Despite the challenges, her parents instilled in her a respect for education and the need to work hard to change one's circumstances for the better. These principles shaped Andreen's character, caring, goal-driven, and gifted with a natural ability to empathize with those around her. Even as a teenager, Andreen displayed an entrepreneurial streak. She helped relatives who sold goods at local markets, constantly thinking up ideas to expand their selection or attract new customers. Before long, she was envisioning broader horizons and began seriously considering a move to the United States. The promise of greater opportunities, both academically and professionally, inspired her. After completing her basic education in Jamaica, she applied to study in the US, seeing it as her first major step toward a new life. The decision to move to the United States was not an easy one. Beyond the nostalgia for her homeland, Andreen faced the challenge of starting over in a foreign country. But according to friends, she threw herself into this transition with her characteristic energy. In her first years in the US, she juggled multiple jobs in the service industry while attending college, determined to acquire the credentials and skills that would eventually allow her to launch her own enterprise. She repeatedly emphasized that she wanted to do something meaningful, caring for people in need, especially the elderly. Not long after, Andreen settled in San Antonio, Texas, where she decided to put down long-term roots. Initially, she worked with small organizations that provided elder care services. During this time, she gained hands-on experience and developed a clear vision of what high-quality support for senior citizens should look like. Not just formal sitter visits, but a genuine sense of family and warmth. Out of that grew the concept for Starlight Homes, the business Andreen founded and ran with exceptional dedication. From its earliest days, Starlight Homes demanded all of Andreen's time and energy. She personally hired staff, conducted interviews, oversaw the quality of services, and never hesitated to take on extra work. If necessary, she would buy groceries for clients or follow up on their health status. This commitment made her a respected figure in the local community. By her late 20s, she had a modest but comfortable lifestyle in San Antonio, where she resided with her husband, Andreen McDonald, a major in the United States Air Force. Together, they presented what most outsiders would consider a picture-perfect couple, financially stable, socially active, and seemingly supportive of one another's ambitions. Yet beneath the surface, as some friends and acquaintances would later claim, there were small fissures in the marriage that, left unattended, might have slowly grown into the fault lines that would shake their entire community when Andreen was reported missing in late February 2019. On a chilly evening toward the end of that month, Andreen's close friends began to notice something was off. Normally, Andreen was punctual, conscientious about responding to phone calls, and quick to text back if anyone needed to reschedule a meeting. But all at once, it seemed she had gone silent. Text messages went unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail, and even her social media, a channel she used frequently to share updates about her business and personal life, showed no signs of recent activity. Concerned but not yet alarmed, a few friends tried to brush it off as a busy period in her work schedule. After all, owning a business that provided round-the-clock care for seniors could be grueling, and it was not entirely out of character for Andreen to immerse herself in special projects or expansions for days at a time. However, the silence extended well beyond what anyone who knew her would consider normal. By the following day, people who depended on her management decisions at Starlight Homes grew worried, and the employees who counted on her daily instructions discovered she had not updated any schedules or rosters. A creeping sense of unease began to spread. Still unwilling to assume the worst, her friend Carla, who had known Andreen from a local entrepreneurial network, decided to swing by the McDonald residence to see if perhaps Andreen was simply under the weather or had some emergency that prevented her from going about her usual routine. Carla remembered that Andreen often took care of details personally, rarely delegating tasks that concerned her clients' well-being unless absolutely necessary. Arriving late in the afternoon, Carla knocked and waited patiently at the door. The silence that greeted her felt unsettling. There was no barking of a dog, no hurried footsteps from inside, and no sign of anyone through the front windows. Carla tried calling Andreen's number again, But it was the same result, straight to voicemail. In that moment, Carla felt an inexplicable tug of dread. She had a key to Andreen's house, given that they were close friends and had occasionally looked after each other's properties, but she hesitated to use it without permission. Eventually, after pacing on the porch for several minutes, she gave in to her anxiety and dialed the authorities for a welfare check, explaining that it was highly unusual for Andreen to be this out of touch. When sheriff's deputies arrived, they noted nothing outwardly amiss from the exterior. The lawn was in decent shape, the mailbox was free from an overflow of letters or packages, and there was no immediate evidence of forced entry. However, when the police entered the house, there was an eerie silence in every room. Andreen's purse, a staple item she always carried with her, sat on the kitchen counter. Her personal belongings, including keys and a phone charger, were scattered around in a manner that suggested she had been in the middle of an ordinary day. Detectives later remarked how it looked as though the homeowner had simply vanished into thin air while in the midst of routine tasks, leaving behind all the essentials most people would take if they intended to step out for more than a few minutes. The sense that something sinister might have occurred hung heavy in the air, even if there was no immediate sign of violence. Over the next few hours, the deputies walked through the premises, taking careful note of every detail that might indicate where Andreen had gone, or under what circumstances she left. In the master bedroom, some clothes were strewn haphazardly on a chair, while the bed was partially made, as if someone started the chore but never finished. Downstairs, the family living area remained mostly tidy, although one detective found a crumpled piece of paper near the sofa, later determined to be a grocery list that included items Andreen had planned to purchase for the week. The more they searched, the more the situation did not align with the notion that she had simply gone on an impromptu trip. Within days, a grassroots effort to locate Andreen sprang into action, coordinated in part by her closest friends who were adamant that something must have happened, as Andreen would never abandon her responsibilities, particularly not her business and her young daughter. Amid this mounting concern, law enforcement kicked their early investigation into high gear, conducting interviews with anyone who might have had contact with Andreen in the days or hours before she vanished. Some of Starlight Home's employees were questioned about her mood, her recent schedule, and any out-of-the-ordinary circumstances they observed. A few reported that she had seemed slightly stressed, but not in a way that raised red flags. Other staff members mentioned that they seldom interacted with her husband, Andre, as he kept a low profile despite living in the same house from which Andreen occasionally coordinated company activities. One employee recalled seeing him in passing only once, briefly, and described him as polite but withdrawn, offering no real insight into the couple's dynamic behind closed doors. During the first 72 hours, the priority for detectives was to determine if Andreen's disappearance was voluntary or the result of foul play. They considered the possibility of a mental health crisis, an unannounced trip back to Jamaica, or even an abrupt desire to distance herself from her professional and marital entanglements. However, none of those theories gained traction when weighed against the evidence at the house and the consistency of her past behavior. Furthermore, phone and bank records showed no flurry of recent activity that would suggest she was making major plans. She had not withdrawn large sums of money, nor had she purchased any last-minute plane tickets. As investigators delved deeper, they stumbled upon subtler indicators that the situation at home might have been more complicated than it appeared. While neighbors generally reported no signs of loud arguments or domestic disturbances, one woman who lived a few houses down mentioned that on a few occasions, she noticed Andreen's car leaving the driveway late at night, only to return a short while later, as if she were taking short drives to clear her head. Another neighbor mentioned hearing muffled conversations through the walls, but admitted it could have been just a television or a normal discussion carried out at a higher volume. Despite the seemingly ordinary facade, these small hints of potential tension did not immediately connect into a cohesive narrative about what might have truly happened to Andreen. As the days turned into a week, the sense of dread among her friends and family intensified. The authorities continued to process potential clues: a partial footprint near the back door, a possible scuff mark on the kitchen floor that looked newer than the rest of the wear and tear, and a small scratch on the wall near the staircase. None of these traces proved definitively related to an altercation, nor did they confirm that Andreen had been forcibly taken from her home. One particularly puzzling piece of the puzzle lay in Andreen's phone records. According to data retrieved by investigators, her cell phone suddenly ceased all activity late in the evening of February 28, 2019. No more calls, no more texts, No more data usage. Typically, her phone was almost an extension of her hand, given her responsibilities managing staff schedules and coordinating patient care. The abrupt silence raised eyebrows. Law enforcement considered the possibility that Andreen had turned her phone off herself, but the more realistic scenario, in the eyes of most people who knew her, was that something occurred that prevented her from using her phone, or that the device was deliberately destroyed or discarded. Adding to the mystery, law enforcement reached out to Andreen McDonald for an official statement. Initially, he told investigators that he wasn't entirely sure where Andreen was and suggested that perhaps she had just stepped away to cool off from some marital disagreements. He claimed she had taken breaks before, though never for very long, and insisted she would return on her own time. Detectives found his attitude somewhat nonchalant, particularly in light of the sheer panic her friends and family were displaying. When pressed for details, such as when he last saw her and whether they had argued, Andreen offered vague responses, reiterating that Andreen was her own woman and could be anywhere she wanted. He did not appear eager to file a missing person report himself, despite her noticeable absence. Behind the scenes, forensic teams combed through Andreen's digital footprints, sifting through emails, text messages, and online searches to see if she had spoken of feeling threatened or had made plans to leave. They noted a few recent messages to friends mentioning stress, but nothing so alarming as to explain total disappearance. Meanwhile, law enforcement discreetly reached out to local businesses, especially those close to the McDonald residence, to see if surveillance footage might show Andreen running errands on or around the day she was last seen. While some camera owners turned over hours of footage, nothing conclusive appeared to show her coming or going at unusual times. As the days following Andreen McDonald's disappearance slipped into weeks, the San Antonio community, already rattled by the mystery of her abrupt vanishing, found itself increasingly drawn to one question. What role, if any, did her husband, Andreen McDonald? Investigators had maintained a cordial yet persistent line of inquiry with Andreen from the outset. But it was his demeanor, coupled with a series of perplexing discoveries, that gradually elevated him from a person simply connected to the missing woman to the prime suspect in what was beginning to look more and more like a case of foul play. Neighbors, casual acquaintances, and even some extended family members started to speak of subtle, disquieting signs they had either overlooked or dismissed as marital tension. Early on, detectives had tried to give Andreen the benefit of the doubt, reasoning that grief, stress, and fear might cause someone to act in ways that could be interpreted as suspicious. When probed about the exact date and time he last witnessed her leaving, he would pause, stare blankly for a moment, and then provide vague references to late February, as though he struggled to recall specific details. To investigators accustomed to reading body language and listening for inconsistencies, this behavior set off silent alarms. They noted how he avoided using Andreen's name, referring to her instead as "my wife," in a monotone that conveyed neither concern nor urgency. Closer scrutiny of the house, and specifically the garage, further reinforced the idea that something amiss had taken place. Though nothing was blatantly damaged or destroyed, the scent of strong cleaning products lingered in certain corners of the garage and kitchen. At first, detectives chalked it up to routine tidiness. Andreen had a well-earned reputation for being meticulous, but a forensic technician noticed an odd discoloration near a drain in the garage floor. It could have been rust, grease, or any number of innocuous substances, but the presence of excessive cleaning fluid in that same vicinity suggested a hasty attempt to wipe something away. Tests would eventually be run to determine if there was blood or another biological material present, but results were not immediate. At the same time, the investigative team began following Andreen's financial trail. There is often no better source of truth in an inquiry than receipts and bank statements. What they found in Andreen's recent purchase history raised eyebrows. Multiple transactions in quick succession for items that seemed peculiar under the circumstances of a wife's disappearance. Specifically, within the days surrounding Andreen's last confirmed sighting, Andreen's debit card showed purchases for large trash bags, heavy-duty gloves, a shovel, and a significant quantity of gasoline. While any of these items might have an innocent explanation, perhaps a yard project or routine household tasks, taken together, they painted a darker picture. Additionally, store surveillance footage corroborated these purchases, showing Andreen in a hurry, grabbing items off shelves with a single-minded determination rather than the casual approach of someone running ordinary errands. He paid in cash at some stores, suggesting an awareness that credit or debit transactions create a clear paper trail. Investigators discreetly collected this footage and added it to their mounting dossier. The next significant turn came when a friend of Andreen's recalled a conversation in which Andreen had confided that she was worried about her marriage. According to this friend, Andreen mentioned that Andre had become increasingly tense and that small disagreements escalated into heated arguments. While Andreen never directly stated she felt physically threatened, she worried about finances, the future of their child, and the stability of their home environment, though she remained resolute in her focus on her business. The friend's recollection, combined with the suspicious items Andre had purchased, caused the investigators to reassess the entire situation. Up to that point, they had been careful not to single Andre out without substantial cause, but now it seemed they had plenty of reason to apply more pressure. Each new piece of evidence opened additional avenues for questioning. Why would Andre be evasive about the purchases if they were truly meant for some benign purpose, like yard work or routine household chores? Why did he not seem alarmed that his wife of several years, whom he claimed had simply gone off on her own, had yet to return or even make contact? When asked these questions directly, Andre stuck to vague answers, reiterating that Andreen was independent and implying that she had a history of brief disappearances, an assertion no one else close to her could confirm. Detectives observed his emotional state, noting that at times he displayed annoyance or frustration at their inquiries, but rarely worry or desperation to locate his wife. Far from exonerating him, his demeanor only served to intensify the undercurrent of suspicion. As the local media caught wind that the authorities were honing in on Andreen's husband, public interest in the case spiked. Law enforcement cautioned against jumping to conclusions. In an effort to dig deeper, a fresh search warrant was obtained for the McDonald property. During this more extensive sweep, investigators looked into crawl spaces, closets, and storage containers, hoping to find any trace of Andreen, whether personal documents, diaries, or physical evidence that might indicate her current whereabouts. A painstaking fingertip search of the basement uncovered a small collection of cleaning supplies and a half-empty bottle of bleach, but no conclusive sign that a crime had been committed there. Outside, in a corner of the backyard, detectives found an area of disturbed soil that they initially feared could be a clandestine burial site. However, upon closer inspection, it proved to be a patch of ground recently used for disposing of yard clippings. At least, that was the explanation proffered by Andre, who was on the property at the time of the search. Crime scene technicians probed the soil, gathering samples to test for any forensic evidence. Word soon got out that law enforcement had discovered suspicious items linked to Andre, stirring the pot of public opinion. So, in the meantime, investigators quietly monitored Andre's movements, tracking his phone, and even placing discreet watch on his activities to ensure he did not leave the city or attempt to destroy additional evidence. The tipping point that elevated Andre from a person of interest to a suspect came unexpectedly, by way of a combination of tips from the community and a key forensic breakthrough. One neighbor, who had chosen to keep quiet initially, stepped forward to report seeing Andre loading large, dark plastic bags into the trunk of a car in the pre-dawn hours of March 1st, the morning after Andreen was last seen. At the time, the neighbor thought it peculiar, but not necessarily incriminating. It wasn't until the neighbor watched a local newscast focusing on the discrepancy in Andre's timeline that she realized the significance of what she had observed. As detectives continued to interview individuals who might have had insight into the McDonald's personal life, it came to light that in the weeks leading up to Andreen's disappearance, the couple had been overheard arguing about finances and business decisions. Several friends told investigators that Andreen was the primary breadwinner, which potentially bruised Andre's ego, fostering resentment under the surface. Analyzing phone records, investigators saw that Andre had deleted large swaths of text messages around the time Andreen vanished, suggesting a concerted effort to remove potentially incriminating communication. In parallel, a thorough search of Andre's digital life revealed internet queries about body disposal techniques and how to handle bodily fluids. Although some queries were partial or deleted, forensic specialists managed to piece together enough data to show that Andre had visited websites. This discovery, along with the earlier revelations about the suspicious purchases, amplified the investigation's sense of urgency. With Andre behind bars on the tampering charge, prosecutors began assembling the skeleton of a case, fully anticipating the need to locate Andreen's body to bolster their chances of a successful conviction. Over the sweltering weeks that followed Andreen McDonald's arrest on evidence tampering charges, the public's grim speculation about Andreen McDonald's fate intensified. Friends, family, and concerned citizens scoured local neighborhoods, greenbelts, and rural areas around San Antonio in the hopes of finding any sign of the missing woman, hoping against hope that she might still be alive. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued to piece together a timeline of Andree's final hours, focusing on cell tower signals and vehicle GPS data that suggested Andreen McDonald had been traveling to remote locations in the days following her disappearance. While his official explanation for these excursions ranged from needing space to think to running errands, the investigators suspected a more sinister motive. They compared these digital breadcrumbs to known vacant properties, thickly wooded areas, and outlying farmland, suspecting that if Andreen had done the unthinkable, he might have ventured to an isolated spot in an attempt to hide all evidence of wrongdoing. Eventually, a crucial tip arrived from an unlikely source. A local ranch owner who had heard about Andreen's disappearance and recalled a detail that gave him pause. The rancher told investigators he had discovered what appeared to be a makeshift fire pit on a remote section of his property, a patch of land he seldom visited. The pit was ringed by scorched rocks and littered with half-burnt fragments that, at first glance, looked like they could be animal bones. Yet something about their shape and the surrounding debris, charred scraps of clothing, twisted metal possibly from jewelry, made him suspicious. With a weary voice, he confessed that he felt uneasy thinking it could be linked to Andreen's case, but feared it might indeed be connected. Sheriff's deputies and forensic specialists rushed to the site, carefully cordoning off the area with yellow tape. Over the next few hours, the team meticulously sifted through layers of ash, soil, and debris, using fine mesh screens to separate even the smallest bone fragments. Preliminary examination suggested that some of the bone fragments were indeed human, likely from the skull, torso, and long bones of an adult female. Though badly damaged by fire, certain segments remained intact enough for potential DNA testing or at least partial identification. Several pieces of cloth were found too, singed almost beyond recognition, which could possibly match the type of clothing Andreen was last seen wearing. Forensic photographers took painstaking pictures of every shard, while the technicians placed each item into labeled evidence bags. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative team. If these were Andreen's remains, then it confirmed what many had feared, that she was not merely missing, but had met with violent, deadly circumstances. Yet the puzzle remained far from solved. The question now became whether this site was where she had been killed or if the remains had been transported there after the fact. Initial tests on the remains, conducted at the county medical examiner's office, showed a high likelihood of them belonging to a young adult female matching Andreen's rough height and build. DNA analysis, however, would take more time, leaving investigators reluctant to make a formal announcement until they possessed irrefutable confirmation. Meanwhile, private speculation exploded among law enforcement personnel, the press, and the public alike. Following standard procedure, the sheriff's office arranged for a specialized anthropologist to examine the bone fragments more thoroughly in the hope of finding any distinctive markers. This expert confirmed that the fragments likely originated from an adult woman, although extensive heat damage meant that certain typical forensic methods, like analyzing intact teeth or partial fingerprints, were of limited use. Days turned into weeks as the official identification process dragged on, each fresh result adding another mosaic tile. Fragmented remains of a jawbone contained enough dental clues to be matched with Andreen's records, and the minimal DNA that could be extracted from certain intact bone shards showed a high statistical likelihood that they belonged to Andreen McDonald. Among the most damning physical evidence was a singed fragment of what appeared to be synthetic hair attached to partial tissue. Comparing this with Andreen's known hair texture and color provided further confirmation. Finally, armed with these collective findings, the medical examiner declared that the remains were indeed Andreen's. This formal identification was a turning point in the case. The sheriff's office announced the news at a solemn press conference, expressing condolences to the family while reaffirming their commitment to obtaining justice. Meanwhile, Andreen maintained his silence except when communicating through his legal counsel. His lawyer publicly insisted that no conclusive proof of murder existed, stating that the remains, while indeed Andreen's, did not necessarily prove how she died or who was responsible. A combative press release hinted at potential alternative suspects or scenarios, but without providing specifics. Public sympathy for Andre was scant at this stage, although some individuals pointed out that, in the American legal system, he remained innocent until proven guilty. Still, in the broader court of public opinion, he was already condemned. Andreen McDonald had been under house arrest since April 2021. However, just days before his trial was set to begin on January 17, 2023, he unexpectedly broke his silence. Until that moment, he had refused to speak about the events leading to his wife's death. But now, he began to share his version of what happened that fateful night. February 28, 2019. On that day, Andre and his wife, Andreen McDonald, were at a tax consultant's office. During the meeting, Andre discovered that a year earlier, Andreen had secretly started a new business without his knowledge. This revelation shocked him and filled him with anger. A heated argument erupted between the couple. Later that evening, the argument continued at home. According to Andre, he struggled to control his emotions and decided to leave the house to cool off, stopping at a gas station. But even that didn't ease the tension. He and Andreen continued their dispute over text messages. When he returned home, he brought up the possibility of divorce and splitting their business equally. This idea enraged Andreen. Realizing she might lose part of her business, she lost her temper and stormed into the room where her husband was. According to Andre, when his wife entered the room, he turned around and suddenly found her standing right in front of him. At that moment, he claims, Andreen unexpectedly spat in his face. "At that moment, I grabbed her because she was right in front of me," he recalled. "I think we hit our heads together, and I believe she got a wound on her face." After that, he says Andreen ran into the bathroom and turned on the light. When she saw her bloodied face in the mirror, her anger intensified. She looked at herself and became furious. "Then she came at me," Andre recounted. He claims he tried to dodge her blows, shielding his face and head. In the midst of the struggle, he grabbed her, forced her to the ground, and kicked her twice. After this, according to Andre, he left the room to put their daughter, Elena, to bed. When he returned about 30 minutes later, his wife was dead. "I panicked," he admitted. Fearing the consequences, Andre took Andreen's body to a field, stripped her naked, and returned home to burn her clothes. However, the evidence collected by investigators raised doubts about Andre's story. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the presence of Andreen's blood on a yellow hammer found in their home. This detail did not match Andre's claim that her death was accidental. He had an explanation for that too. Under oath, he testified that he later returned to the field where he had left the body, bringing a hammer, a can of gasoline, and a plan. "I was furious and wanted revenge on the person I believed was responsible for everything," he said. From the entire story, it became clear that he considered his wife to be the one to blame. When opening statements began, the prosecutor painted a grim portrait of a man who resented his wife's success and independence. After both sides made their closing arguments, tension reached its pinnacle. The prosecution asked the jury to consider the mountain of coincidences that, in the aggregate, formed a damning case. Conversely, the defense leaned heavily on the absence of direct eyewitness testimony. They suggested he had panicked after an accidental death, an explanation that, if believed, could downgrade the charge considerably. When the jury retired to deliberate, the community held its breath. Days of deliberation passed, with no quick verdict, signaling that jurors were deeply wrestling with the complexities of the case. Finally, after what felt like an eternity to both families, the jury announced it had reached a verdict. The jury found Andreen McDonald guilty, but not of murder in the first degree. Instead, they convicted him of a lesser form of homicide, specifically manslaughter. The verdict delivered a complex blend of relief and anguish for Andreen's loved ones. While they had hoped for a murder conviction, they took solace in the fact that the jury had held Andre accountable, rejecting his claims of innocence. The judge handed down a maximum sentence for manslaughter under Texas law, 20 years in prison, along with a sizable fine.
Hello everyone, dear friends. Today we will look at one disturbing case that will surprise you. That's why watch this video until the end. 12-year-old Tia Palmer had her whole life ahead of her, but tragically, a horrific fate awaited her. An ordinary teenage girl fell victim to a terrifying act of violence. Her biological mother, sensing a real threat to her daughter's life from her husband, placed Tilly in a child protection center, hoping it would save the girl and give her a chance at a bright future. However, as it later turned out, the good intentions of strangers only worsened the situation for young Tia, as her loved ones affectionately called her. Soon, a terrible tragedy occurred. Tia's father forced Cindy Palmer, the girl's biological mother, to place her daughter under the care of Child Protective Services. The woman believed she was doing the right thing, as circumstances required her to save her daughter. Being a victim of domestic violence herself, she sought to protect her child from a similar fate. The complex family dynamics made it impossible for her to properly raise the girl. Tia grew up to be a troubled child, often running away from home to escape parental conflicts and prone to delinquent behavior. In January 2015, by decision of the Child Protection Center, the 12-year-old girl was sent to live with a wonderful family residing in the quiet town of Chambers Flat, about a 40-minute drive from Brisbane, Australia. This cozy little corner had a population of around 2,500 people. Tia foster parents were the Thorburn couple, the head of the family Rick, his wife Julene, and their two sons, 19-year-old John and 18-year-old Trent. By that time, the girl had already gone through several foster families, as her difficult personality created challenges. Some considered Tay quite confrontational. The Thorburn family was no exception. The girl was unhappy about the prospect of living with two much older teenage boys, but she had no choice. Rick and Julene had been married for over 25 years at the time of her arrival. Rick used to work as a truck driver, but had to switch to a lighter vehicle due to a serious back injury. That's how he started a business selling fast food from a van and also owned his own horse farm. Julene ran a home daycare. The family was considered very decent, respected, and exemplary in all circles, which is why Child Protective Services chose this particular household for Tia. For 4 months, it seemed that the child had settled into her new family and continued to live there until the tragic events that followed. The girl attended Morrison State High School, located just a 20-minute drive from home. Life appeared to be improving, with everyone getting used to Tia and her getting along with her new housemates. But in reality, not everything was as rosy as it might have appeared from the outside. October 30, 2015, began as a typical day in the Thorburn household. Rick drove his foster daughter to school and returned home to work on his car. A few hours later, the school called and informed them that Tay had not shown up for classes. The girl had run away from home before, having a difficult childhood and a habit of escaping from her problems. But this time, she could not be found. Although she usually quickly returned on her own or was located, Rick posted on social media describing the situation and asking anyone who knew Tia whereabouts to respond. However, no one answered the call. The foster family knew that the girl was eagerly anticipating Halloween, which was just a few days away. Tay had even prepared a costume and was upset by Tay's disappearance right before the holiday. So the Thorburns contacted the police, and the teenager was declared missing. However, no one really searched for the girl, believing she would soon return after another runaway attempt. Less than a week had passed since the foster child disappeared. In the early morning of November 5, 2015, the police received an alarming call. A local fisherman informed the emergency services that he had found a body in the coastal reeds in the shallows of the Pimpama River. This location was approximately 30 miles south of Tay, last known whereabouts a week earlier. By this time, the body had significantly decomposed, likely aided by local wildlife and climate conditions. The police officers who arrived at the scene could not even accurately determine the gender of the deceased person, let alone identify them. They could only roughly establish that it was a teenager. The body was in a terrible state, with no clothing except underwear. The grim find was sent for an autopsy and forensic examination. Comparing the body to the list of missing persons in the area, law enforcement officials surmised that the deceased could be 12-year-old Tay, who had disappeared about a week ago. The suspicion was later confirmed by DNA analysis in a laboratory, and the police's worst fears were realized. During the examination, experts concluded that the injuries initially mistaken for animal bites were most likely inflicted by a person. The girl had become a victim of horrific violence. The case was reclassified as a murder, and an investigation began. Considering that Rick Thorburn was the last person who had likely seen Tay alive, law enforcement officials started their investigation by talking to him. From the very beginning, he aroused suspicion with his behavior and contradictory statements.
Do you have anything to do with the death of Tia Lee Palmer?
Absolutely not. All right.
How was her demeanour that morning?
She was on key. She was happy, just really sprightly. And I was sort of pleased that she was happy that day. I said, well, we're going to have a good day.
Mate, is there anything you can tell me about this matter?
Nothing at all. I dropped her off.
But all of this had yet to be proven and thoroughly verified. Investigators also decided to speak with other members of the Foster family, hoping that one of them might have additional information. However, questioning the relatives did not yield any useful insights. Everyone confirmed the head of the family's account that he had taken the daughter to school at 7:30, and no one had seen the missing girl since. The detectives then went to the school to verify the Thorburn statements, and here they managed to obtain valuable data. Law enforcement officers interviewed over 100 people, 7th grade students, Tay classmates, her friends, and teachers. It turned out that on that day, no one had seen the girl come to class or even show up near the school. After reviewing the footage from surveillance cameras outside and inside the school on the day of the disappearance, the detectives were convinced that Tay had not come to school and had not been seen near the entrance, which seemed strange. Where could the girl have gone then? However, 2 female students, friends of Tay, revealed that their classmate had serious problems in her foster family. One of them reported that Tilly had begged to be taken to her home because the Thorburns were mistreating her, and trouble awaited her. But due to her young age, the friend could not make such decisions for her family and bring Tay to her house. Moreover, she did not think the situation was that serious. Shortly afterward, Tay died a horrible death. This happened just a week before her disappearance. The friend suggested that the tragedy might have been related to problems in the family, although Tia did not specify exactly what her foster parents were doing to her. After talking to other students, the police realized that, apart from the Foster family, Tia had no one else who could have harmed her. Suspicions about the Thorburns intensified, so the investigators continued to scrutinize this family. None of the Foster relatives categorically admitted to the accusations of domestic violence, claiming that Tia had made everything up, just as she had done previously when running away from other families and complaining about them. The police verified this information and found that the girl indeed had a tendency to run away and was a troubled teenager. All the people close to the Thorburns and their neighbors characterized them as an exemplary family. Many took their children to the Thorburns' home daycare, and no one could believe that such decent people were capable of hurting Tay. The general opinion was that the girl had simply run away, as she had done before, concocted a story about mistreatment, and actually got into trouble and fell victim to an attack. Therefore, the police had no grounds to suspect the Thorburns and began looking for the cause of the murder elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Foster family continued running their home daycare. During the investigation, detectives also questioned about 300 registered sex offenders in the area who might have been involved in a sexually motivated attack. But this also failed to provide any leads or even the slightest clues as to what had happened to the teenager. Most of them had alibis, and some no longer even lived in the area. No suspects were identified among these individuals. On December 4, 2015, about 100 meters from where the body was found, a shoe was discovered that likely belonged to T.I., as well as her school backpack. This story gained such widespread publicity that it attracted considerable public attention. It was covered by numerous television channels in Australia, so soon the whole country learned about the case. Land police have identified a body found on the Gold Coast as 12-year-old Tay Palmer. She hadn't been seen since last Friday, as she made several pickets were held before the funeral, with people demanding that those responsible for the girl's horrific death, which she clearly did not deserve, be found. The biological mother of the deceased organized protests and demanded answers from the police about her daughter's death, appearing on television to draw public attention. The woman was outraged that Child Protective Services had not taken care of Tay, largely because of this. Over 600 people attended the girl's funeral, most of whom had never even met Tay in life, but came to pay their respects and express their indignation. Many of those mourning the deceased were dressed in white and purple t-shirts with hearts and the girl's name. Purple was her favorite color. About 400 white roses were placed on her coffin, and purple balloons were released into the sky as the hearse took the body for a private cremation. 5 months had passed since the day of T. Palmer's murder, but law enforcement officials still had no serious leads. A reward of 250,000 Australian dollars was announced for any information that could assist in the investigation. The person or people who know something about this are too loyal to whoever they're helping. So, I'm guessing that money is not really going to be an issue. Tae's mother appeared on television pleading for help, urging witnesses to come forward and the perpetrators of this terrible crime to confess. In addition to the monetary reward, the police guaranteed exemption from prosecution for any accomplice who had not committed the crime themselves, and would be the first to provide important information. However, even this did not help uncover anything new. The police received several calls from concerned citizens, but they led nowhere. No one could provide useful information. The summer of 2016 arrived, and the police still did not even have a prime suspect. Detectives interrogated one criminal after another, those with a history of sexual violence. The state of decomposition of the body at the time of discovery did not allow forensic experts to obtain any leads, so investigators did not even know what exactly had caused the girl's death. The only assumption they managed to make was that T had been strangled, as evidenced by a broken hyoid bone. The most likely theory at the time was that the girl had been abducted by a random motorist near the school, as the area where parents drop off their children was not covered by surveillance cameras, so anything could have happened there. But this was merely a theory of the police. The sum of 250,000 Australian dollars for information that would help apprehend the perpetrator still remained unclaimed. Only in May 2016, after more than 6 months of persistent work, did the state police department receive an anonymous call with valuable information. The unknown informant stated that he had something to tell about Tia and the Thorburn foster family. According to him, the Thorbers had been looking for a troubled child from the very beginning in order to receive increased benefits for her, and they had no real feelings for Tae. For them, it was purely a mercenary interest. The anonymous caller also confidently claimed that all members of this family could have been involved in what had happened to the girl. Unfortunately, the informant did not provide any further details and hung up the phone. Establishing his identity to obtain additional information proved unsuccessful, but thanks to this call, the police decided to return to the version of the foster family's involvement in the murder. After all, at the beginning of the investigation, they had already received information from students about domestic violence in the Thorburn household. But at the time, these allegations could not be confirmed and were dismissed. Now, the detectives turned their attention to the foster family once again. While verifying the words of the anonymous informant, the police again spoke with some of the students at the school. One of Tae's friends shared that the girl had confided in her about an intimate relationship with a younger Thorburn son, 19-year-old Trent, who was considered a local heartthrob. Tae, due to her young age, did not fully understand what was happening and thought they had a genuine relationship, as Trent assured her. The girl was even in love with him and admired the horses on the farm, but at the same time, she was terrified of Trent and his entire Iyer family, so she wanted to run away from them. It is likely that in addition to sexual abuse, there were instances of brutal physical abuse against Tae in the house. These statements from the student required thorough verification, but repeated questioning of the Thorburn family members yielded no results. They all categorically denied any suspicions and accusations, especially regarding molestation of a minor. However, due to serious suspicions, the Thorburns' permission to operate a home daycare was revoked, and their license to host foster children was suspended. Law enforcement officials installed listening devices in the foster family's house. Almost daily, they received shocking information that shattered the image of a decent family that the Thorburn couple and their sons carefully maintained. Specifically, the family convened a meeting on October 29, 2015, following which Tae vanished. At this meeting, Trent told his parents that the girl had a suspiciously aching stomach, which raised concerns for Rick and Julene about the possibility of the 12-year-old being pregnant. As it turned out, the foster parents had learned about the younger son's intimate relationship with Tae shortly before her disappearance. Trent had a relationship with the girl when no one was home during the wiretapping. The young man admitted that he had repeatedly engaged in sexual intercourse with his foster sister for almost 10 months, practically the entire period. She had been under Thorburn's care. Eventually, 19-year-old Trent approached his parents when he suspected that Tae might be pregnant. He was afraid that their 7-year age difference would effectively turn him into a criminal. Rick told his son not to worry, promising that he would deal with the problem himself, as evidenced by the Thorbs' overheard conversations. The girl was terrified of her foster father. She was most afraid of being alone with him. It seems these fears were not unfounded. Other family members also treated Rick with considerable trepidation, as behind the mask of a decent family man hid an extremely cruel and dangerous individual. The same evening after the meeting, Rick ejected the rest of the family from the house, leaving him alone with his foster daughter. As per the agreement, everyone returned a few hours later, but Tilly was nowhere in sight. Upon inquiry about the girl's whereabouts, the family's head responded that she had fled, thereby resolving her problems. She would definitely not tell anyone anything. The relatives suspected that Rick had assassinated Tay. As he was too confident in her silence, when one of the brothers tried to enter the girl's room, his father forbade him in a threatening manner. None of the Thorburn brothers dared to contradict Rick, so they all simply forgot about the incident. It became evident that the story of Rick driving his foster daughter to school, after which she disappeared, was a complete lie. In reality, he could not have done this because Tay was no longer his foster daughter. She was in the house at that point and was most likely dead, but what exactly Rick had done to her remained a mystery. He concealed this information, even from his own family, during the wiretapping. Detectives repeatedly heard the family head instructing his relatives on what to say and how to behave, so as not to arouse suspicion from the police, and they all obediently complied. Law enforcement officials initially summoned the Thorburn sons and their mother for questioning, believing they would be the easiest to crack, and indeed, as investigators began to reveal the information they had, the interviewees gradually started to talk. The longer the detectives communicated with them, the better they understood what was really happening. In that house,
The last time that you saw Tia Palmer alive, when was it?
In the bedroom, sitting on a bed.
Okay.
I said goodnight to her there.
Yeah.
And expressed to her that maybe she needed to stay there and put herself to sleep when she was ready, sort of thing.
And where was Rick?
I think he was outside the kitchen door, like waiting for me to come back outside.
Okay. Was there anyone else in the house?
Nobody else in the house, no.
And then you left?
So the exact words, it's all taken care of or something. I said, what do you mean by that? I said, don't worry. Don't ask any questions. I've taken care of it. And I went to go to her room and he said, don't go in there.
You know, you said that he was a bit worried about what might happen to Trent.
Yeah,
So we're going from that to killing him while you're out.
yeah. No, I would never have left the house if I thought that. I had no indication, no feeling that he would do something like that at all.
I wanted to try and tell the police that I'd been told what had happened. But I knew that if I did that, I wouldn't make it 10 steps out of the door. That he would do the same to me. I just wish it didn't turn out this way. I wish none of this ever happened.
Yeah.
Rick had arranged everything as if he were trying to protect his family. After carefully reviewing the footage from surveillance cameras near the school, the police were convinced that Rick Thorburn had gone to great lengths to conceal his crime and confirm his fabricated story. Several cameras captured his car as he drove towards the school that morning, but not a single frame showed the girl exiting after these accusations, and suspicions rained down on the Thorburn family. Authorities accused Julene and Joshua of giving false testimony and trying to manipulate the investigation. Investigators suspected Trent of sexual assault and Rick of premeditated murder, and they attempted to conceal the crime. The detectives came to the conclusion that the man had murdered Tay and purposefully disfigured the body to impede its identification. Initially, they couldn't even ascertain the victim's gender. However, thanks to DNA analysis, they were able to confirm the deceased's identity, despite Rick's apparent ignorance of such tests. Law enforcement officials also had strong reasons to believe that the family head was involved not only in Tay murder, but also in the brutal physical and sexual abuse of all the children, including his own. They brought 9 charges against Rick, some of which had nothing to do with the deceased girl. Trent faced accusations of incest and false testimony. Upon discovering the sale of Trent immediately after his disappearance, the family confiscated him from the new owner for inspection. Bloodstains were found inside. All these events took a toll on Rick's health. Rick lost consciousness on the day of his detention. The man's condition was so serious that doctors had to put him into an induced coma, but after a few days in the hospital, Rick regained consciousness. Doctors suggested that he had deliberately provoked the deterioration of his health by taking some medications. But fortunately, this scoundrel did not manage to evade responsibility for his crimes. Finally, all the members of the Thorburn family stood trial. The cynicism and cruelty of their actions shocked the public, which openly wished for retribution against these inhumans capable of such brutality towards a defenseless girl. The prosecution's devastating tactics virtually ignored the defense's arguments. Julene and Joshua pleaded guilty to all charges and agreed to testify against Trent and Rick. Almost without deliberation, the jurors found all members of this family to be real monsters, guilty of various crimes. The jury sentenced Joshua to 3 months in prison and his mother to 1.5 years for her false testimony. Trent, who also confessed to all charges, received a 4-year sentence for incest, lying to the investigation, and attempting to obstruct justice. The mother and son are now free. Even Trent, who had raped Tay, was released in 2018 after only 16 months behind bars. However, due to his son's reputation and other crimes, he received a life sentence in May 2018, with the possibility of parole no earlier than 20 years. The shocking circumstances in this case not only sparked public outrage, but also garnered media attention. The Australian legislative system undertook a review of the laws concerning the principles of protecting children in care. The government introduced stricter checks to identify potential criminals among foster parents, particularly those with prior legal issues. Furthermore, the government introduced several new provisions specifically for troubled teenagers and their adoptive or foster families. The tragic story of Tay Palmer exemplifies the failure of the child protection system, as those tasked with ensuring safety and care end up becoming criminals. The girl, who already had a difficult childhood, fell into the hands of monsters who took her life. This case broke. A review of child custody laws and procedures revealed the need for stricter background checks on potential foster parents, particularly those with a criminal past. People debate whether the punishment was sufficient for the perpetrators. The most terrifying aspect is that the actual prison terms for most of them were surprisingly short. Is this fair to the deceased girl's memory? Let this chilling story serve as a reminder to all of us that it is the responsibility of adults to protect children, as well as the responsibility of society to ensure that this protection is reliable. Only then can we confidently declare that we are making every effort to prevent future children from experiencing the same suffering.